Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Dry Bean webinar. My name is Dale Razula. I'm the Provincial Specialist for Special Crops and Forage Crops with Saskatchewan Agriculture, and I will be chairing today's event. Today, I would like to acknowledge that the presentation is being virtually delivered from Treaty 4 territory. The Ministry of Agriculture respects and has the honor of working on lands in Treaty 4 territory, a treaty that was first negotiated and entered into in 1874 in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan. It's important to recognize that the land on which we are virtually hosting from is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and home of the Métis peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that we respect and honor all other treaty territories that we work on throughout the province, Treaty 2, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and are committed to move forward in partnership with the Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For today's webinar, CEUs are being offered for CCAs on this webinar. In order to get a credit, you need to attend the entire live event, and there will be a QR code at the end of the presentation to collect the credit. If you missed the code and have attended live, please email us afterwards and we can work with you to get your credit. Certified crop science consultants wishing to collect CEUs for today's session may submit a CEU request through the CCSC program self-reporting database at ccsctracking.ca. I also want to mention that the 2023 Crop Diagnostics School will be held in July, on July 25th and 26th at Indian Head. More details are coming soon, so stay tuned for that event. Each presentation today will be followed by a live Q&A. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and we will share relevant downloadable handouts with you in the chat box area. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you'll be able to. Recording links will be sent out later today in follow-up email. An evaluation will pop up at the end of the webinar this morning. Please ensure you fill out the evaluation, as these help us determine what topics you want to learn more about and helps prioritize research needs for the future. We have a few housekeeping notes to keep in mind during the webinar. If anybody has any questions during the presentations, you may type them into the question box in the bottom right-hand side of your control panel. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but may need to limit them due to time. Your question will remain anonymous and will only be sent to me. During the presentation, you will be muted so that we can ensure there's no feedback, and that nothing will interfere with the audio. Our first speaker will be Dennis Lange. He will be talking about all things dry bean agronomics. Dennis Lange is a provincial pulse and soybean specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. He's been in the department since 2011 and has been involved in the pulse and soybean industry for the last 26 years, working with soybeans, peas, dry beans, and various other pulses. Dennis worked in private industry, specifically with dry bean agronomy prior to coming to government, and has experienced the highs and lows of the Manitoba dry bean industry. He has worked with growers and industry to educate and inform them about various advancements in the dry bean world. Dennis is also an avid photographer and enjoys teaching photography in his spare time. He's also known for his collection of over 150 Hawaiian shirts and counting. So, Dennis, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Well, good morning all, and thank you for having me on this webinar here today. It was quite interesting. When I was putting the slide set together here, I was kind of going back through some old slides over the years and bringing back some new information in here. So I think it should be quite educational. And like I say, if you do have any questions, send them over to Dale, and we'll address them at the end here. So so just kind of starting off here, we're going to get going here. And one of the big things in Manitoba, and I kind of have this graph up here to kind of give you an idea of where the acres have kind of gone in Manitoba over the years. We've had some big years. Our biggest year was back in 2002, was just over 300,000 acres. And then the acres kind of started falling back a little bit. 04, 05 was a very, excuse me, very wet year. The yields were quite low, actually, probably the lowest we've ever seen. We had frost in August in 2004, and wasn't much better in 2005. But acres kind of dropped off, and then wasn't until probably somewhere in the 15, 16 range, we started to see that increase come back up again. The one thing that we really noticed is that back in the early 2000s, we didn't have soybeans that we were growing in Manitoba. Soybeans really started to come in the mid 2000s. And so once the soybeans kicked in, the dry bean acres dropped off. And so kind of moving forward here, if you look at our 10-year average, we're looking at just over 1,700 pounds per acre. And our 5-year average is just over 1,800 pounds per acre. So quite interesting to see those trends over the years. There's been a couple drops here, you know, especially when you look at 2021, we had a lot lower yield than what we've had in because of the dry conditions. It was just almost a little bit too dry. But just kind of the way the years have gone with dry bean production in Manitoba. I throw this slide up here because this is something that's kind of maybe drove the soybean industry in Manitoba away from dry beans, is the soybeans' ability to take excess moisture. Now, you can see in these two photos here, the soybeans is in the lower left corner here. The dry beans, these are some navy beans actually, and you can see how yellow they were. So that was partly part of the big reason why we dropped off from that high of 300,000 acres. This past year, we broke a record in Manitoba for most bean classes. You can see here where our yields were at. We had roughly just over 115,000 acres harvested, but some pretty big numbers, especially in the pinto category. There we broke a record at 2,400 pounds per acre. Compared to the previous year, we were only 1,200 pounds per acre with how dry it was. So for the most part, we had a really good growing season. Things started off pretty late, but things did take off once the beans got planted. We had really no stopping the beans, no major weather events through the season, and the yields kind of reflected that. I pulled up, thanks to Dale for these slides from Saskatchewan. This just kind of shows you the two main areas here in 2022 where growers were growing dry beans, mostly box and pintos in that Outlook and Riverhurst areas here. Not looking at a lot of acres in Saskatchewan. I've done a presentation back in Saskatchewan a number of years ago, back in the early 2000s. I think at that point they were somewhere in that 15,000 acre range, and they were being tried in different areas as well. And now I think we're down a lot less than that. We're probably in that maybe 2,000 acre range. But the areas that are growing them are irrigated and are having some good success there. So I'm going to start a little bit backwards when it comes to a normal agronomy talk. A lot of times you start talking about seeding rates and you're talking about variety selection, all that kind of stuff from the start. We're going to start from the back end because quality is king when it comes to dry beans. So one of the things I'm going to start off with here is rotational concerns. And what I mean by rotational concerns is what some of the previous crops that you have to be aware of when you're growing dry beans, and especially if you've grown soybeans in 2 years prior to when you want to put dry beans in. This is a sample where there was some admixture at harvest time, and what can happen is those soybeans sometimes can remain either dormant or if they do produce any seed the first year after production, generally you'll see it in that second year after production. So in some cases, I typically recommend to growers, if you planted soybeans in year 1 and you plant wheat in year 2, year 3 should not be dry beans. It should be something else, because you could end up with a sample of this where these soybeans are intermixed with the pintos. They're very difficult to separate out. Soybeans are considered a food allergen in the dry bean business. So in some cases, if the numbers are high enough, so even over 0.5%, you can get that sample rejected. Now, you may not be dealing as much with soybeans in Saskatchewan to the same degree, but you do deal with black beans, and that's kind of the same thing as well. If you're trying to grow different classes of beans, you got to keep more than 2 years in between, just because of this rotational concern and the admixture issue, because once it's there, there's nothing you can really do to eliminate it. One of the other big quality issues that we deal with dry beans is cracked seed coats. Now, cracked seed coats become important in both at harvest time and also at seeding time, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But at harvest time, if you have a seed lot that has a high cracked seed coat, meaning that there's been mechanical damage to the seed, either the seed was too dry when the grower was harvesting, and the cylinder speed or concave spacing wasn't adjusted properly, you get these hairline cracks that start to show up. And why that's a problem is if a bean goes into a can, then when those beans are reach the consumer, you end up with a sample like this where you have all these hairline cracks and kind of the insides kind of spill out. It's not a very attractive procedure or attractive thing to kind of see as a consumer. So there are ways of improving that at the harvest time. A lot of times it's just monitoring your moisture, doing what they call a cracked seed coat test, just to make sure you're doing a good job harvesting. So when you're doing a cracked seed coat test, what I like to recommend to growers, and what a lot of growers do, is they keep a small container of water in the combine, and every so often they'll grab a sample off the hopper and throw it into this small container of water and let it soak. What you'll see is these hairline cracks start to show up and it starts to peel off. If you're getting more than 10% in your sample, then you want to be adjusting. So for example, if you're at 20%, you maybe want to slow your cylinder speed down. That would make a difference in how much damage you have. Typically, growers run anywhere from 300 to 400 RPMs. But in some cases, you want to, if you're running any faster than that, you want to slow it down so you're not creating any damage. And even just adjustment of concave and will make a difference as well. In some cases, if you have we'll go to the next slide here. If you have a wide wire concave in, then that will aid in making sure you don't have any cracks in the sample. But those are some of the things you can kind of look at. One of the other things that really becomes important with quality is earth tag or dirt tag. What can happen is if you end up with the sample that has, or a stand that has some green plant material in it, and you pick up a bit of soil when you're harvesting, you can end up with kind of what you see on the right here with these small beans here with the earth tag on it. And I'll just go to the next slide here compared to the good quality on the left. When you're looking here, this is something you don't want to see on any type of bean. And this typically comes from the fact that there's been some moisture in the sample, so from green plant material, and the producer has picked up some soil as well. And usually what ends up happening is it usually ends up smearing in the unload auger. So it's always a good idea to check the sample for earth tag in the back of the truck to make sure there's no earth tag happening. If the sample looks good in the back of the truck, you're good to go. Because I've seen growers that have had good looking samples in the hopper, but the earth or the soil is built up in the cross augers, and as it's being unloaded into the truck, you get this smearing action happening. So another real safety issue when it comes to dry beans is glass. Because you're clipping these beans pretty close to the soil surface, you want to make sure you're not picking up any kind of glass along the field edges. Any kind of foreign material is a real concern. If a receiving station does end up getting a sample with glass in it, it becomes a real problem with them, and it becomes a point of possible rejection as well. Okay, I'm just going to pop this slide up here and kind of go through some of the steps here, but just to kind of give you something to keep in mind when we're thinking about growing dry beans, there's not a lot of processing that gets done to the bean itself. Typically, the beans are brought into the processing plant for cleaning, put into overhead storage. The initial cleaning is through the scalper, remove some of the splits and stalks, anything that's easy to remove. Goes over to the destoner after that, removes any stones, any large earth, dirt balls kind of thing. Gravity tables will also clean out some of the dirt balls and some of the smaller seeds. They sometimes use a polisher, to help make them look a little better. But in some cases, if you can't rub the soil off between your hands, the polisher isn't going to improve that at all. And then from there, it goes to an electric sorter. It separates out by color. So in some instances with admixture in there, if it's a very low level, the color sorter can take some of those off types out. The problem is if it's too high, then the color sorter has to slow down, and that's a bit of a bottleneck for the processors. They don't like that. And then from there, it goes into the bagger. Now, once it goes into a bagger, it can be shipped out in these large totes in bulk, but to the end user, and from there it goes into your can. So it's not a lot of processing that gets done with this, but just something to kind of keep aware of. So, so how do you manage some of these, issues at harvest time? Because that's where the quality does come into play. Probably one of the biggest things that you can do to improve your quality if you're dealing with earth tag is looking at putting a screen under the feeder house. You want to be able to remove that soil as quickly as possible in the harvesting process. So either under the feeder house, some growers have even put it under in the actual header itself. But putting screens under the clean grain or under the return or any spots in that process of harvesting doesn't really gain you anything. But if you can put it under the feeder house, these are slotted screens, so the beans kind of roll over and don't fall through, but any of the small pieces in soil kind of fall through. Another thing that growers typically do is they put a wide wire concave in their combine just to ensure that these beans can fall through the concave relatively quickly. You want to thrash them out quickly. You want to thrash them out early in where the concaves are. You don't want the beans to pass all the way through, because that's where the damage and the splits can occur. Direct harvesting, a lot more growers are going down that road. When I first started in dry beans, we probably only had maybe 20% of the acres in Manitoba that were harvested through direct harvest. Over the years, with the advent of better varieties and more growers going to more of a solid seeded situation versus a row crop situation, less cultivating, less band spraying, growers have gone to a direct harvest. And variety selection becomes key here, but typically the amount of soil that you enter the combine is a lot less than when you're doing your typical undercutting system, where you're cutting the roots, and in some cases some cases not doing a proper job, and that any of those roots having soil on it will end up in the sample. With your typical row crop undercutting system, growers will use a sun pickup to help reduce the soil from entering the combine as well. Just moves the material into the combine a little bit slower. It allows it to shake off that soil a little bit more. And when growers are undercutting, they're typically windrowing into larger windrows. So this is about a 40-foot windrow coming into the combine. Again, more plant material coming into the combine actually helps cushion the harvesting process as well, so you're not getting as many splits as well. So another good thing to look at. I throw this up more for interest's sake. The growers that are using specialized combines for dry beans, whether it's the Pick Up One Step or the Amadas in Manitoba, they're doing that on kidneys and crayons, the ones that have very high value. And in this particular instance, you can see here by this photograph here, these bean moisture was actually dry. It was actually at 16%, but the plant material is still quite green, and the grower didn't want to stain the beans. So this machine was able to separate out those dried seeds, throw the green plant material out the back, and not have any issues with that. Fairly expensive venture to purchase one of these machines. However, if you're going into kidneys and crayons, it's something that's a necessity. Again, just a couple more shots of those machines there. And the unloading is a little different as well. The unloading is a dump system, so again, eliminating any chance of potential damage to the seed. Always remember, coming to a table near you. So from the time it goes, leaves the processing facility and goes to the end user for packaging, either into a can like you see here. This is what we always have to keep in mind. This is a food product that we're dealing with, so anything we can do to improve the quality is good. Kind of moving backwards again, one of the big challenges that dry bean growers do have is the management of white mold. On some years, white mold pressure can be quite severe. In Manitoba, we don't spray every year for white mold. It all depends on how dry it is at flowering time and what your plant material is like. But with respect to plant material, and in particular varieties, there are some differences between how susceptible varieties are. So the bean types like pinks and small reds are more sensitive to white mold than pintos and kidneys. Blacks are fairly tolerant, so you usually have to have a lot of pressure for white mold to develop. This is developing later in the season. Some of the factors that go into it, when growers are spraying for white mold, you're typically spraying at early flower, usually into that anywhere from the 20 to 30% flowering stage. So just when the pin pods are starting to show up. Factors that can affect that mold development are things like higher plant population. So if you have a really dense stand, whether it's row crop or solid seeded, not a lot of air movement at that time of flowering, because the plant stands are so thick, and you have a lot of moisture either through rainfall or heavy dews, those plants can be a lot more susceptible to white mold. Some years we don't end up spraying. The way I always look at it is, in irrigation, of course, that's going to be something that you're really going to have to be aware of, because you're giving moisture throughout the growing season, and white mold can develop because you have a lot more growth. But in Manitoba, for growers in the western side of the province, what we typically recommend is, if you're not spraying your canola every year, you probably won't spray your beans every year. Whereas in the Red River Valley, we spray our canola every year, and the beans are kind of more of a, whether or not the weather is conducive and whether plant stand is conducive. So this past year in 2022, growers were spraying for white mold, but in 2018, 19, and 20, it was very isolated fields that growers were spraying, mostly where there was not a lot of air movement through the canopy and really thick stands, and growers wanted to protect that. Because what you have to keep in mind, this is a protectant. Spraying it at the stage that you see in this photograph here, that is way too late. That's not going to do you anything. If your bean plants are still wet at lunchtime, chances are you're in a pretty good time frame for spraying for white mold, because they are can be quite susceptible. A couple other points on white mold. You want to spray before row closure, because you want to cover those flowers. So plants typically the flower at the lower portion of the plant, so you want to have really good coverage. You want to target that 20 to 30% flowering, or when you're starting to see those first small pin pods start to show up. And in some cases, if weather conditions are conducive and sand is there, you might need to go a second application. There are some products that are listed in the Guide to Crop Protection. I've listed the ones kind of here that we have on our list, so it's the same list that you guys have on yours as well. Products like Lance and Proline are some that growers are typically using in Manitoba. What you'll see here is, what I've added is whether or not there's control or suppression. So those control, meaning that you'll typically get a little bit better control of that white mold, versus suppression, where you get it suppresses it from developing, but maybe in some years when there's higher pressure, you want to be looking at something that's maybe a little stronger on the white mold development. Okay. So white mold we can do something about. Bacterial blight we really can't per se once we see it in season. So this is a picture of bacterial blight in some dry beans. Typically with bacterial blight, you can get it throughout the growing season. If you get it later in the season, when you see it on the pods here, that can affect the quality, because it can penetrate the pod and affect the seed quality. If it happened earlier in the season, a lot of times the beans typically grow out of it. With bacterial blight, usually what ends up happening is you have some damage to the plant that occurs. So either from hail or blowing sand around, blowing soil, the wind whipping the plants, typically followed by rain afterwards, often kind of triggers that bacterial blight. What we can see, usually within 10 days after a weather event, you'll start to see those lesions start to show up. They can spread up and down the row as well, especially if you're cultivating dry beans and you're cultivating when those plants are wet. So stay out of the fields when the plants are wet. And there are different bacterial diseases such as halo blight, common blight, also known as bacterial brown spot, all kind of the same pathogen. Nothing you can really do to control it in crop. Now, there are some control measures that you can use though. Things like planting disease-free seed is also very important. So if you're bringing in seed from, let's say, from the US, typically those are it's good quality seed. If, however, you're planting binram seed and you notice a lot of disease in your field last year, probably not a good idea to plant that this year, because you can have infection early in the season. Using a 2 to 3 row crop rotation to avoid that chance of contaminating the crop as well makes a difference. Burying that plant debris in the fall to make sure that that plant debris does break down. Over the years, there's been growers using some copper-based products to help slow down the spread of halo blight, but they're not super effective. They have to be applied early and before the symptoms really show up, and they have to be applied often. Now, there is a product registered for bacterial blight control in dry beans. It's a product called Oxidate. And the reason I bring this up is I get questions on this every year. Now, this is some work that was done by Chris Gillard. He is a researcher with Guelph University on dry beans. And we're just going to zoom in here. And some of the work that he did it both on kidneys and navy beans. He looked at some inoculated control for bacterial blight. This was on the kidney bean field. And he looked at a couple different products. Oxidate is actually a hydrogen peroxide based product. So I looked at applying it one application and to see if there was any improvement in not only leaf severity, but also in yield. So the products that they tested were Oxidate, a copper-based product, or Parasol, Sandate. And you can see here, they looked at leaf severity 7, 13, 19, and 26 days after. The letters indicate, the same letters indicate no statistical difference. Inoculated control has the A behind it. So you can see that the Oxidate 7 days later really didn't show any improvement. And again, Oxidate is registered for up to 8 applications. So that single application probably isn't going to get you what you need. A lot of times just waiting and it typically, the plants typically do grow out of it. Going 13 days on the Oxidate, still no improvement. And same with 19 and 26 days. But it's always yield that we look at. So with respect to yield here, comparing the inoculated control to the Oxidate, no statistical difference in yield. So again, something that if you are looking at trying something like this on your farm, make sure that you leave a check strip and be prepared. You know, if the bacterial blight is quite severe, you may need to go multiple applications to possibly see some improvement. But a lot of times that's with good weather conditions, it typically does grow out of it. North Dakota did kind of the same kind of research down in Prosper, North Dakota. They did see a little bit of improvement in the severity with using products like Oxidate. But when it came to yield, there was no statistical difference between the untreated and the Oxidate. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. Now moving back a little closer to seeding, we're looking at weed control. Weed control in dry beans, typically we like to control weeds early because they're not very competitive. Some of the things that I like to tell growers is scout the field regularly before spraying and after spraying. You want to make sure whatever you do spray in that field, those weeds are controlled to make sure that there's no issues later on. With dry beans, you want to try to keep them as weed-free as possible up until that 6th trifoliate stage. Beans just perform a lot better that way. Weeds that emerge with the crop cause greater yield losses than weeds that germinate once the crop is up. So early weed control is key. One of the things that you can look at for early weed control is looking at a bit of a pre-emerge, pre-plant type scenario. So there are some products that are listed in the Guide to Crop Protection here, as you can see here. And I would suggest doing that to help prep that ground. When you're looking in crop, I always like to have growers start off with using, you know, an edge type product in there. Edge or Treflan is always a good way. Eptan is another good way of going as well, depending on your weed spectrum. And then following up in crop with a few of these products that you have here. Now, I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs and all these products. The one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're doing post-emergent is staging. So a lot of these products after the 1st trifoliate, and some of these products are only up to the 2nd trifoliate. Some products are only registered in the Red River Valley, so that's listed in the guide as well. But these are some of the products that growers have been able to work with to help control some of the weeds. Again, just a summary, pre-plant incorporated herbicides, good way to start. Treflan Edge, Eptan, also some pre-spring burn-off as well. And follow up with scouting after crop emergence to know what weeds you have in the field. And then also follow up afterwards as well. As far as staging goes, when you're looking at staging, this is from the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. They have a nice staging guide on their website here. You're looking at that 1st trifoliate up until the 2nd trifoliate for most products is where you want to spray. So you want to spray early and make sure you're on top of those weeds, because those weeds can be quite difficult to control if they get too large. Seeding. Seeding dry beans, whether you're seeding it with a row crop planter or an air seeder, always very critical to keep a few things in mind. Planting depth, really important, anywhere from 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. That depends on, number one, the type of moisture that you have. But in some instances, like Eptan, for example, if you're using Eptan, you want to read the label as well, because they do suggest planting seed down to 1.5 inches because of where the product is. You don't want to plant it within that chemical layer. Beans like warm soil. So in Manitoba, we generally don't start seeding until about the May long weekend here. We want that ground to be nice and warm. There's an old saying in the dry bean industry, you want to see beans twice in 1 week. Once when you put them into the planter and once when they come out of the ground. Ideally, if you can see that, your beans are off to a really good start. Beans can be kind of slow coming out of the ground, and sometimes planting too early doesn't gain you anything. You actually lose more because those beans sit in the ground for a lot longer. We mentioned earlier about harvesting and monitoring seed coat damage. You want to do that in spring as well. If your seed is coming from an area of the U.S. that produces typically fairly dry seed, you might want to just do that soak test on that seed just to see where how much damage there is before you put it into the planter. The germination doesn't always reflect that because that seed coat damage usually comes from mechanical damage. So you may need to increase your plant populations. And always really important, I can't stress this one enough, is once you've gone out and seeded your beans, you want to go out about 4 weeks later to check your emergence and do some stand counts, just to see how good a job you did seeding and whether or not you need to make some improvements for the next year. There's a slide here just shows you the length of a single row to count when you're doing plant stands, and this will give you 1/1000th of an acre. So if you're in a 30-inch row, you're getting you're counting 17 feet 5 inches. So in that 17 feet 5 inches, if you have 60 plants, that would be 60,000 plants. So relatively easy math. Now, this is an interesting slide that I put together years ago, and I like to use it when I'm talking dry beans because sometimes with growers of dry beans, there's a little confusion about live plants and planting rate. So live plants is what you want after germination mortality has been factored in. That's the stand that you want to end up with. Now, when I'm talking to a new grower, I'm saying, you know what? If you don't know what your mortality is, some of the numbers that I've experienced over the years that typically what you want to be targeting for planting. So you end up with that 125. So for Navy and black beans, I like to be in that 140 to 150, 150,000 plants. So when you factor in germination mortality, then you're hopefully be in that 130 range, 125 to 130. If you're going to a 30-inch row, typically 100 to 110,000 is what you want to target. So then you end up with that 80 to 90 range. So again, always keep these kind of numbers in mind. For pintos, in a 9 to 12-inch row spacing, we typically are upwards of that 90,000 plants. I always like to be a little on the higher side when it comes to plant population, just because sometimes with dry bean seed, mortality can be a little higher. So starting off with a good amount of seed in the ground is something I like to recommend. A few other things to kind of keep in mind: a lot of the seeds for dry beans does come in from the U.S., so that seed is dry. So good idea to do a bit of a cracked seed coat test like we showed you earlier. Throw that seed into a container of just room temperature water, let them soak for about 5 minutes. Anything where the seed coats that you see is starting to separate off, pull those out, do a count. If you're over 10% to 15%, maybe adjust your seeding rate. If you're under 10%, then you're golden. Always handle that seed with care. And if you're seeding with air seeders, make sure that you keep your air volumes just fast enough to keep the seed flowing through, because air seeders can do a lot of damage to that seed if it's very dry. So what happens if you do have a damaged seed? Well, this is what a healthy plant looks like, and this is what we call a bald head. So there, in this particular instance, this is where the seed coat was damaged, and this is kind of what you get. So the main growing point here you can see is damage. So it's going to start getting growth from the axillary buds, which are found at the cotyledons here. They sometimes will produce a plant, but they're not as resilient as what a soybean plant would be. So again, if you have too many of these in the field, you're going to have a reduction in stand at the end of the day. Fertility for dry beans, what I typically like to look at is some recommendations from North Dakota. We do have some recommendations in Manitoba, but they follow fairly closely. If you're looking at, let's say, 30 pounds left over in your fall soil test, you're at a low level. And for those high yield potentials, you want to be in that 90 range if you're in an narrow row production. If you're cultivating, you can be a little lower because there is some of that inter-row cultivation will allow for a little bit of that nitrification through the season, allow for some of that release of that nitrogen for the plant. But I like to tell growers, try to have about 100 pounds available for the crop. Dry beans don't inoculate very well. There's really no inoculant that is commercially available for growers, so that's where the nitrogen comes in. What's interesting, Kristen McMillan from the University of Manitoba has been doing a little bit of work on this the last few years, and has looked at both navies and pintos in this situation over from 2017 to 2019. This is a slide set from 2017 to 2018. Some of her work has actually found some interesting numbers. They're actually not seeing any significant yield increases until they get up to that 140 pounds of nitrogen, which sounds like a lot, but again, no real significant difference from going from 0 to 105, not until that 140. One of the things that I do see in that 100-pound available nitrogen is I see more plant growth as well. So it may not translate into yield if you have a drier year, but if you have good moisture, it sometimes will take advantage of that. So again, just some information, some food for thought on that. As far as phosphorus, with phosphorus, typically on the Olsen, if you're in that low level, you're typically adding 30 pounds of phosphate. You want to be, if you have the capability on your planter to do side banding, then you can put this down at seeding time. However, if you don't, you're going to have to do a banded application in the previous fall. Some growers do some broadcast incorporation in spring as well, but it's sometimes if you're in drier conditions, it doesn't work quite as well. So because you don't want to dry that soil too much. If you're at a higher level in that 12 to 15 ppm on your soil test, then the phosphate level applied is quite a bit lower, and as you can see by these slides here. So, and as far as potassium goes, if you're at a high level for potassium, no need for additional potassium. If you're at a lower level, you can see here by the levels, you're adding around 20 pounds. Again, doing that as a band application or broadcast incorporated. Now, in Manitoba, there are some growers that do apply zinc because it is one of the nutrients that we do see a response with dry beans on fields that have low zinc. And there are some foliar sprays that some growers can do to top up during growing season. If you see symptoms like this yellowing, some of this innervating chlorosis from the edges, if you're doing a pre-plant, 3 to 5 pounds of zinc with your fertility application in spring prior to planting is what a lot of growers typically will do. A few slides to close off on here. One of the things that you need to be aware of is some of the recropping restrictions for residual herbicides. So if you are planting dry beans for the first time, or you're an experienced grower, always check to see what products you sprayed on that field last year. So if you would have used on your wheat any Prestige, you want to keep at least 2 years before you plant dry beans on that field again. There's a list of products here. You can find that more complete list on page 91 and 92 of this year's Guide to Crop Protection. But it's always good to check those things out ahead of time because that can be a real concern for dry beans. I've had growers get caught with spraying velocity on dry beans and then velocity on spring wheat and then wanting to go dry beans the next year. And that can be quite devastating for the dry beans. One of the last slides, last few slides, because as we're working backwards, we're getting back to variety selection now. And quite an interesting website here. Saskatchewan seed growers have their interactive seed guide. So I pulled up some information from that site just to show you some of the varieties. But one of the things I always like to tell dry bean growers, and I tell this to pea growers as well, but with dry bean growers, grow what the buyer wants. It's a lot easier for you to sell a variety that way. There are different quality parameters, things like cracked seed coats. Sometimes color can be an issue for some bean types. If you're looking at more some of the specialty types, seed size, those types of things, there are definitely some differences. But have that conversation with your buyer to make sure that the variety that you choose is something that is acceptable to them. Make sure the maturity that you're choosing for your variety or the variety that you're choosing has a correct maturity. If you're growing something that's suited only for southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, you're going to be in for some pretty big disappointments when you have frozen beans. Also, you want to look at things like pod height if you're direct harvesting. Now, this is from the Interactive Seed Guide. You can go to the Saskatchewan Seed Growers website to pull this information up. And you can see here some of the things I look at. Number of site years tested, which will tell you how many different locations that these varieties have been tested at. So here we have Blackstrap as your check. We have some Pintos in here, Medicine Hat, White Mountain 2, and White Mountain 3. Under irrigation, you can see what the percent of the yield is here. Island and Medicine Hat did quite well compared to Blackstrap under irrigated. Didn't do as well under dryland. Maturity here, they're all medium maturities, which these are all varieties that will suit your growing region, Saskatchewan, quite nicely. You just don't want anything in the late category. Pod height clearance, also really important. Anything above 70% is good. And seed weight, not so much as important in a pinot, but for some of the other classes, something to keep in mind. And the same thing here when you're looking at some of the black varieties. For those early maturing varieties that you guys have to work with, Blackstrap seems to be one of the earlier ones. It's one of the newer ones from CDC. Has some good yield potential. The other ones like Jet and Super Jet have been around for a little longer. Have really good pod clearance. Don't stack up quite as well as Blackstrap, but it is a little bit later than Blackstrap. But I would still put Jet into that medium category here. It's interesting, in this one they put it under the late category as compared to the other one, put it into the medium, but I would still consider it pretty early yet for those varieties. So with that being said, these are the kind of fish we grow in Manitoba, but those are my thoughts and comments on dry bean production in Manitoba. So I open it up for any questions that you guys may have.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent, great presentation, Dennis. Very informative, and we do have some questions. And just as a reminder, if you do have questions, please enter them into the chat box at the bottom of your control panel. I have one to just kind of start off with. You talked a little bit about solid seeding and direct harvest beans, the type of bean being really important for that kind of a scenario. Like, would you say like black beans kind of fit into that mold the best, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, blacks and pintos now. Blacks have always been beans that have been suited for solid seeded production. So something like Blackstrap, Jet, those varieties are well suited for solid seeded direct harvesting. The pintos now are a lot of the varieties over the last few years have been changing to more upright types. So the White Mountain types typically are more of the upright types. They will direct harvest quite nicely. And but one thing to kind of keep in mind, if you're used to direct harvesting peas, peas are different for harvesting peas than harvesting dry beans. Dry beans on a number of years can be quite short, especially if you have some drier conditions and you don't get that growth. So peas can typically feed quite nicely into the combine with lots of plant material, but dry beans, that's why it's really important to make sure that you have an upright variety. You want to make sure those pods are off the ground. The use of an air bar, if you have, it would be definitely a benefit for dry beans because it keeps that knife cleaner. But in Manitoba, we've gone to more of a variety called Vibrant. It's probably would be a little bit too long for Saskatchewan, but the majority of those beans now are typically direct harvested, just because those pods are more upright. So we don't. When I first started, we didn't have many of those pintos or any of those pintos that were really suited for direct harvest. In Manitoba, they were your typical viney beans, but now with the varieties that I mentioned here, most growers would have pretty good success direct harvesting that, keeping in mind things like plant stand, making sure you have enough plants there to have enough material come fall time, but also to making sure your combine is set up with you know, a good flex header, an air bar, those types of things to make harvesting much easier.
Great. We have a question here. I'm not sure if this is going to be something that you can answer, but maybe you can give your thoughts on it. And it is, how far north in Saskatchewan would it be possible to put in dry beans, dealing with tight rotations and looking for more cropping options? So,
well, this is for comparison. If you look at where Swan River is in Manitoba, Swan River is north. So if you draw a line across from Swan River west, that would be typically where your upper limit would be. Now, Swan River is not a big dry bean growing area. They are growing some blackstrap up in that area, and they've been actually quite successful. In the dry year, which was 2 years ago, that particular RM had about 2,000 acres and was the second highest yield by RM in that Swan River RM. So with those early varieties like blackstrap, they can go further north because they are definitely, they're not as early as the earliest soybean, but they're getting pretty close with something like blackstrap. So as long as you have, you know, a field that has, you know, good drainage, a little sandier soil is always good for dry beans, and planting an early maturing variety, it would be interesting to see that. But Swan River drawing line across would be as far north as you'd want to go. So.
and just to add to that, I do know that Saskatchewan Crop Insurance has outlined an area where they do provide coverage for through crop insurance. So, and that's on the Saskatchewan Agriculture website, and people can have a look at that if they're interested in in knowing those areas. And typically,
Yeah,
it's like Dennis said, though, it's in those kinds of areas that where they have this coverage, and so.
yeah. And just to clarify, I think I might have said north of Swan River west,
Okay.
across, just to make sure I got that point across. So.
Okay. Next question. Again, you probably wouldn't be able to answer this, but they're asking, what is the split between row planted and solid seeding for dry beans? And maybe you can answer that on a Manitoba basis. I think for Saskatchewan, generally most are row planted, and there are smaller proportion solid seeding, mostly in the dryland areas, but
Yeah.
under irrigation, it's mostly row planted here. So I don't know. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
it's a bit of a mixed bag in Manitoba. Like back in the early 2000s, it was kind of like an 80-20 split, so 80% row crop, 20% solid seed. Now it's kind of a mixed bag, more so from the standpoint of we have growers that are still planting rows with pintos, but they're not cultivating. They're broadcast spraying, and then they're flex heading those beans. So it's still, you know, the way I look at it is, if you're getting into dry beans for the first time and you want to see how it works for you, use your air seeder and plant the populations accordingly, making sure that you're not damaging the seed, but start off that way. If, however, you have access to a planter will give you a little bit quicker emergence. It's using less seed. And even for if you want to flex head those beans, as long as you're not killing those beans, you can still flex head those beans quite nicely in a row. So rather than saying, okay, well, what percentage either way, it's more the way I would look at it would be, you know, look at what type of system that you have available on your farm. But really, if you have access to a row crop planter, I always like to see dry beans planted in rows. The stand looks better, and they just seem to perform a little bit better as well in rows. Even though some of the data, you know, narrow rows sometimes shows a little higher yield, but you know, quite honestly, the row crop beans we grow in Manitoba generally look really good. The solid seeded beans do look okay, but in some instances can be a little bit more challenging when it comes to, you know, I guess a little bit more challenging when it comes to, you know, establishing stands and stuff like that because of the unevenness in planting. So,
The next question, I think you kind of answered it already, and it's basically where do you see dry beans as a fit other than irrigated areas? And you already talked about that a bit. And Saskatchewan is kind of split up into different climatic
Yeah,
zones, from the brown to the black soil zone. And from what we've seen, most other than irrigated areas, they like moisture and they like heat. So
yeah,
it's kind of probably the black soil zone where they might do their best
yeah,
production. So.
yeah. The way I always kind of look at it is, if you can grow 60 bushel peas, don't grow dry beans, because typically that means you're too dry to really get the good yields when it comes to dry beans. If, however, your peas are struggling, you're struggling in that 30 to 40 bushel range, because of maybe a little bit more moisture than what the peas can handle, dry beans in that situation might be a consideration. But keeping in mind, the black soils, warmer conditions, always always things to consider. But that's how I always kind of compare dry beans and peas. If you have dry conditions and peas do really well, probably going to be a little bit too dry for dry beans. But that Swan River area has been able to grow very high pea yields and also some dry beans. So it can happen, but you have to be just more selective on the fields that you choose.
Okay, what are some of the common rotations in Manitoba that include dry beans?
Um, Canola is usually incorporated into that. Corn is incorporated. Cereal and oats is also incorporated into there. I try to discourage growers from putting beans on ground that's suited for soybeans. Now, the analogy that I use with peas and dry beans can actually hold true for soybeans and dry beans. If you have a field that really performs well with soybeans, that means you generally have a fair bit of moisture on there, probably more than what the dry beans can actually handle, because soybeans can handle a fair bit. So I try to avoid soybeans in that dry bean rotation for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier as well, with respect to things like volunteers of the soybeans coming through in the dry beans. But I like to see dry beans 1 and 3 years. I think that's a reasonable expectation. And then incorporating things like canola and corn and the cereals into that rotation is what I would like to see.
And just one more question here that I thought of, and when you talked about fertility with nitrogen in particular, like we know that the inoculation of dry beans is just really it's not that effective. But would you recommend inoculating irregardless of that, or just go ahead with
Inoculating? No. Um, yeah, it's just the issue with inoculation in dry beans is Kristen McMillan is doing some work on that now to field test some of the work that Ivan Resnick has been doing on dry beans. So it's almost next to impossible to find dry bean inoculant. And with the older strains of bacteria that we used to have, the research has shown it was always very inconsistent with yield from site to site. So one site you might get a benefit from the older inoculants, and the next site you get none at all. And in order to remain consistent and produce those yields, growers in North Dakota and Manitoba has gone to applying nitrogen to boost those yields. Now, once you develop a bit of a history, some of the work that Kristen's doing now is showing that you're getting some bacteria, natural bacteria in the soil that's helping those dry beans along as well. So that could be one explanation why they didn't see that increase in yield at those high levels, but that's speculation on my part. So the other side of the coin is if you're with those older inoculants, how the seed treatment affects the bacteria. And with some of these newer inoculants that they're working with or trying to develop, they're seeing much better results with that, where it's not affected to the same degree. So if you're growing dry beans the first time, look at your soil test. If you're somewhere in that 80 to 90 pounds in the soil, then I typically wouldn't put any down. But if you're only about 30, then I would kind of top it up into that 80 to 90 or 80 to 100 pound range. In Manitoba, we really haven't seen any, with some of the work that was done back in the early 2000s, we didn't really see any increase in maturity with going those higher rates. Now with irrigated ground, I still think you should be okay yet with that. Like even that's not a huge amount. It's when you start getting above 100 pounds and the irrigated ground, that might be a little bit more concerned with maturity.
Okay, well, I guess that that rounds us up for questions then at the moment, Dennis, and there may be more later. But
Okay,
thank you again for this great presentation, and it was good to hear from you with your wealth of experience, and as we're really pleased that you could join us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and for the most part, my voice held out. I've been battling a cold for the last 2 weeks, and if it would have been any other day, it might not have been as good today. So.
Well, I think that Hawaiian shirt really helped. So
there you
thank
go.
you very much. Okay, great. Thanks again. Okay, up next we have Anna Vargas. Anna is currently working as a postdoc at the University of Saskatchewan, studying nutritional components in lentils and also breeding and genetics of dry beans. Anna received her master's in plant breeding and genetics from the University of Vargas, Puerto Rico in 2016. Her PhD, Plant Sciences, University of Saskatchewan in Canada, 2021. Anna has worked with pulses since 2008 with jobs such as breeding assisted with molecular markers for main bean diseases, anthracnose, some viruses, common bacterial blight, and rust. Also as a breeder technician for 4 years in charge of crossing blocks, screening for diseases, running field trials in 7 different countries, Central America and the Caribbean. Supervised seed production in Honduras. All these activities were in the bean breeding program in Honduras under the Feed the Future funding through USAID. Anna is interested in pulses in general, mostly beans and lentils. Her top interests are nitrogen fixation, agronomic traits, disease resistance, root physiology and architecture, nutritional components, and wild relatives. So with that, Anna, if you would take over and present today, you're on.
Yes. Just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
I can, yes. Would you like to turn your video on as well?
I'll probably leave it like that just because my connection is a bit slow, just to make sure you're smoothly. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So this first presentation, good morning, my name is Anna. Thank you for the introduction. This first presentation I am doing on behalf of Kirsten. She asked me to apologize on her behalf because she had a last minute thesis defense. So I am gonna do my best on presenting what she had prepared for you guys today. And this is about the dry bean breeding program in Saskatchewan. So let's start talking about what are the breeding goals. So first, of course, yield. And in this, I guess, is really important that we have to remember we are in the age of adaptation. So this is a subtropical crop. So the main thing we want probably is that varieties can actually make it to maturity in this area. And also, another thing we definitely want is to generate varieties that have an upright position and makes the whole process of harvesting easier. Pot clearance is definitely among our goals. We typically want varieties that have 80% of the pots above the 5 centimeter clearance margin. And I will talk more in detail in the next presentation about that. Seed quality is always a parameter that is important, and that will be size, shape, color, and each of them like in their respective market classes. So for disease resistant, the focus right now is common bacterial blight. In the previous presentation, we learned a lot about all these diseases. Also anthracnose and hollow blight. So we are also trying to study white mold. The thing is like, there is really no major source of tolerance identified so far. So the only mechanism that we know for tolerance right now is what we call the open canopy architecture. And what, as we like to say, is probably a matter of the crop resisting one more shot of water at the end of the season. So we don't really inoculate. So what we do basically is opportunistic evaluations in nurseries under irrigation most of the time. So the other is common bacterial blight, which is a disease usually more predominant after flowering. And for this, we have really well-established markers that we use, cast markers. So we do market-assisted selection for screening most of our materials, or right now all of our materials. So tolerance is great in black beans, but this is more challenging when it comes to larger beans like pintos. All the materials in the program from now on, let's say, should have tolerance to CVD. So the other is, as I mentioned, hollow blight, which appears early in the season. Most beans from pinto and navy blacks also have relatively good tolerance or resistance to this disease. But when it comes to the other types like yellows, cranberries, and kidneys, those are more susceptible. So it's very interesting that the IgG marker, which is probably the main marker we use for bean common mosaic virus in other regions in Central America and the Caribbean, seems to be a good indicative for tolerance to hollow blight. It's not perfect, let's say, but it works really well. It gives you a really good indicative. So probably has the other diseases, and has mentioned before, like clean seed will be the key to keeping our fields clean. So anthracnose is becoming definitely a big problem in Saskatchewan, especially in wetter years. The classic early symptom is the leaf vein necrosis. Stem lesions will occur similar to those observed in the stems or in the leaves. Then it will show up like this target-like circular lesions and pods. So there is genetic resistance available for race 73, which is one of the most prevalent, but we are also currently working on race 105, which I believe most of the materials in Saskatchewan don't have resistance to or tolerance. So right now, all the materials in registration trials are tested, like other seed-borne pathogens. Again, clean seed, key to keep it under control. And also, so in this process, the program, the focus will be looking for reliable markers that we can use in the breeding program. So a little bit of an update on the varieties. So here is the seed guide. And the data is all relative to CDC blackstrap because it has a wide adaptation in Saskatchewan from irrigated to dryland. Here are the lines from the CDC, some of them, and also as well from other programs. So now maturity in most of the materials is medium to late, possibly because there is indeterminacy in most of these materials. So most of them are type 2. In the case of CDC Ray down here, is a type 3, which is more for a wide row system. In the next presentation, I will probably, as I said, cover all related to pot clearance. So then what's new? One of the newest varieties for Saskatchewan is CDC Sunburst. It is much better color compared to CDC Sol. There is a huge advance in yield compared to CDC Sol, 120%. It matures earlier, which is fantastic. It is a type 1 plant. It has also like moderate susceptibility to diseases. And that's definitely the next step to improve our resistance. And it's currently licensed to Rudy Agro. So another variety is CDC Whitestrap. It is a new navy that we expect to have seed available next year. It is higher yielding than portage, and this could be in part because it matures 2 days later than portage. Much better seed coat color. It also has tolerance or resistance to major diseases, and is currently licensed to McDougall Acres. So the next one, there is also a black line that should be available soon. And one of the things Kirsten asked me to request was like if anyone has ideas for a prettier name to let her know. So is higher yielding than blackstrap, matures 2 days later. And something really important also is that if this is harvested, this variety is harvested too early, hard seeds can increase. So that's something really important to take into consideration. It will be released via SPG. It has a slightly better port clearance and anthracnose compared to CDC blackstrap, and is up for tender right now. So what's in the work pipeline? So the program is currently working on higher yielding pintos, also in determinate and indeterminate yellows with CVB and hollow blight tolerance. So also black and navies with higher yield than mature earlier. Possibly a great northern and a pink variety. And we are also looking for partners to continue funding the breeding program. Basically, that's definitely a top priority right now. So a little bit of what to choose, like if you're growing beans, and like some aspects to take into consideration. So bean cultivars are definitely very region specific and react different to different environments. An anecdotically example that we have of this is a case that was observed in 2019 with the cultivar Vibrant, that is a slow darkening pinto, which is early in North Dakota and was very late here. And then we also have the example of portage that is late there, but is also, excuse me, very early here. So there is a lot of specificity when it comes to like maturing, and also different races and different places of all the diseases. So very important to take that into consideration. So also a high pot set, specifically for direct harvest, like we've been talking about this, as a high priority. Also always to consider what your target market is before selecting a cultivar. Like this is not like a bulk crop that you will just sell with the exact time not really being as important. Like beans are still like a very specialty market, so important to know your market first. Also source of seeds is really important and can be a big problem. Be always aware where your seed comes from. And here we have an example in this picture, which is not only segregating for time. Let's start with that. We can see like clearly some maturing plants, then some really later ones. So you really don't want that. But other than that, this field was infected with hollow blight. So, and some other fields have been spotted after that. So it's really important that we are aware where our seeds come from, especially when we are getting seeds from the US. So always in general, just know your sources. This is a much better field than the one in the slide before. And in this presentation, please contact Kirsten if you have any questions. You can email her, or people who know her and can phone her, please reach out. She will be more than happy to answer any questions from this. And thank you everyone for listening to this one. I don't know if I should directly proceed with the next one.
Thank you, Anna, for that great presentation.
Thank you.
Did you say you had more slides that you wanted to talk about, or was that?
Yeah, well, this was Kirsten's, so officially I am going to start mine right now.
Okay.
Yeah, questions from this one probably to her.
Okay, so if you want to, you have more than that to present, you can go ahead and start that now, if you wish.
So I have the next one. Oops, taking a minute. So in this presentation, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I am doing currently in beans, which is like some agronomic and breeding approaches that we are following to improve harvestability of dry beans. This was initially a project that Hygiene started a few years ago. Then she moved to another job, and I inherited the project, and I love to inherit it because it was my way back to beans, and I love beans basically. So we have a few students involved in this, Taylor and Queen, and then Gursahib is growing the sites in Outlook. So that's sort of the people working on this. So let's start talking harvestability of dry beans. Harvestability related loss. It is important definitely in dry bean production, and there is no question about it. It's one of the most probably important contributing factors to losing yield. And low pod height is one of the primary contributors to this loss. So harvest loss what we know for now is that can be more severe in narrow solid roads, and when it's directed, when you combine directly. So most available dry bean varieties have about 70–80% pods above the critical height. Some of them can be as low as 15 and 35%. So that give you as low as 65. So that will give you losses of 15 to 35%, which is extremely high, just because we have the pods too low. So we basically divided this experiment in two parts. The first part of this project basically follow an agronomic approach, testing seeding rates of different market classes to study the effect of seeding rates on pod height. So the idea is that we provide the most suitable seeding rates to producers upon the completion of this project. We're still running sites this year. And the second part is basically develop molecular markers, which is more of a long-term approach for pod height to be used for market-assisted selection in the dry bean breeding program. So understanding the other thing is that understanding the genetic control of these characteristics will give us like the most adequate strategy to optimize this gain in the long term. So for these experiments, it was quite fun. We did a lot of measurements, including pod length, stem diameter, pod clearance. So for pod clearance, we basically use a bar that is a 5 centimeter height, and then we count all the pods above that level. We also recorded lodging, which definitely influence pod clearance, and all the possible parameters that we could think of that will influence being lowers in the plant. We definitely study them. We also did measurements of canopy height, because we know in general that canopy height will be an indirect measurement of growth rates in general, and this will impact pretty much everything that is happening and how the plant grows. So for the first experiment, which was the seeding rate, as I said, the idea was to have a short-term solution to adjust and improve the harvestability in the varieties that are currently growing. So we established trials in 2 locations during 2 years. We still have to do a few experiments this year. We use 6 varieties from 3 market classes, and we basically group them in blacks and navies versus larger pintos. And this was basically to have a more cost-efficient approach. So we use 4 different seeding rates in each of the groups, and all the trials were established in a randomized complete block designs. So these 2 figures show us the effect of the seeding rate in the phenological cycle. And so we have 25, 30, 35, 40, 45. These first 4 will be for for pintos, and then these 4 will be for blacks and navies. So as we can see here, it really only affected the cycle at 25 at flowering, and then there was a range of 36 to about 45 on average, and then differences were not really observed among the other treatments. Likewise, if we see days to maturity, these were consistent across seeding rate treatments with a range from about 78 to 95 days after seeding, but not really a big influence, which is really good. Then when we see in the left figure, we have the maturity canopy height that was significantly higher for navies and blacks when we seeded at 40 plants per square meter, while the pinto beans with lower seeding rates had similar canopy height with seeding rates at 25 and 35, and these were actually higher than 30. So if we see in the right figure, which is pot clearance, we can see that range about from 80 something, 83 to 96 among the treatments. So significantly higher pot clearance was observed at the higher seeding rates, which is sort of what we are looking for black and navies. However, we really didn't see that difference when we compare the pintos. So in these figures, I am showing you how the yield was for each variety under the different seeding rate treatments. So overall, if we see at a glance, they yielded more when they had higher seeding rates, densities, and we can also see that probably very clearly here in the pintos. So Island had the highest yield at the highest seeding rate, but then when we see CDC WM3, is not quite, is ranging on the higher densities, but it's not really different from this other. So for the black beans, if we see black diamond, definitely yielded the best at the highest rate, but that wasn't really the case for blackstrap. Then for the navies, if we see definitely the best results in the case of envoy, but then not really for portage. So what we are noticing is that this is somehow very genotype specific, which is why we probably knew this from the beginning. It's really important that we address this from the genetic perspective in a more long-term approach. So for that, we are studying a bean diversity panel, which is a collection of materials from 14 different market classes. This panel is a really great collection because it includes materials from a market panel that was established previously here. Then we added some accessions from Durango and then from a US panel. And then it was great that we were also able to include some Mesoamerican accessions from breeder collaborators in Central America. And this is a representation of each of them, of the classes. So we established this also in 2 locations, 2 years, 3 replicates. And we also, we really want to address this from 2 approaches. First, a diversity panel that is basically individuals not related, but then we also want to do this in a biparental population with related individuals. So we are studying this risk population that was developed previous to this experiment and for other purposes, and is segregating for different sorts of traits. One panel comes from the breeding program, which is this that now is CDC WM2. And the other parent comes from a yellow variety from Mexico called Higuera. If we see here the distribution, they are pretty much equally distributed among the population in browns, yellows, pintos. We do have a few lines that are still segregating for color. We are keeping both for different reasons, but very few of them. So we also conducted these experiments at 2 locations. One is Campbellsfield, that is irrigated. The other is Preston, that is a dryland. This really allows us to compare not only the genetic aspect, but also under 2 different systems. 2021 in particular, which is these pictures, was a really tough year, and the differences, as we can see here, were very drastic. Preston pretty much didn't grow really much after this. So that was 2021 was a really interesting year in breedings for beans for sure. So moving to some of the results that we preliminary analyzed for this part. In general, we observe a huge variation in pod related traits and a wide range of values. Also, in some cases, differences between the 2 environments across both populations. So lowest pod height, which is one of the most important that we evaluate for pod clearance, range from 1 to 40 centimeters, meaning that the first pod on the plant is actually, in this case, rich in the soil or has 40 centimeters. That was on the irrigated side. And then in the dryland side, values were similar in the lower end, but definitely much lower in the upper end, which is, it's just a matter of the plants really staying extremely small because it was a very severe year. So in the this is in the VDP, but if we can see in the VRL7, there wasn't really much of a difference in that year. So pod clearance was also a bit different among the sites in the bean diversity panel, but not really in the VRL7. And because of time, I am only presenting for one site here, but this really switched in the year after. So we'll be really interested in analyzing this data combined when we finish. So in both, we definitely again saw a high range from 0 to 20 in most cases to 100% of pod clearance, which is really, really encouraging. So those with very high pod clearance are definitely of our interest, and we are continuing to study them. And of course, taking into consideration all other aspects, because there is really so much to consider here. So it's very interesting because this population is segregating for a lot of things. So a lot of things have happened along the way, and there are other things that we decided to continue to pursue and work on. One of them is growth habit, and this is specifically for the BRO7 because this will be really way easier to study in a biparental population. So this population is specifically segregating for 3 growth habits. First, we have the type 1, which is basically upright and determinate. Then also we have the type 2, which is also upright, but then with vines, but then is indeterminate. And then we have the type 3, which is a prostrate growth with vines and also indeterminate. We can see it like all over the place here in the ground. So Queen Sturby, she's a MSc student. She's doing a thesis on this, and she's basically evaluating if we can use drone data to predict growth and development in common bean. It is definitely a really cool project. So for this, she's taking canopy measurements manually, like every 2 weeks, as shown in the pictures, and then we are also flying the fields at the same time and then trying to correlate both. So she's doing both canopy height and then growth habit. So this figure is showing us the correlations between those 2 type of measurements, and is basically like, is telling us, can we really have any hope that we can use this data, drone data, to predict any ground data and save us all the time to do it manually. So these results are at 6, 8, 10, and 13 weeks after planting. This is probably just around harvesting time. In general, they all have a positive correlation, with the strongest being if we can see 8 and 10 weeks for predicting. This was a first attempt, and is really we really have hope that we can improve this even better. But it's definitely very promising. So another way to see it is like when we analyze this information based on the different growth habits. So we start definitely seeing more differences and where that inaccuracy or accuracy comes from. So for time 1, we see that this correlation is pretty much a perfect correlation. And we will expect it to be like this way, because with no vines and the plants growing upright, is way easier to capture accurate data. It gets a bit less accurate, let's say it, for type 2 after flowering, especially we see the flowering line here, maturity line here. So the predictor is a little bit less accurate, and it's definitely all the vines growing to whatever they want to grow, and with wind and all those things, or if it's a dark day when you fly, it might not capture all those vines. So that really needs to be a little bit or pressurized in a way. And then we have the type 3, which is actually very few lines among this population that are type 3, but it's also way more accurate. And part of this is because it's really easy to detect when you have all these vines on the ground. Images will capture that really easily. So we really, as I said, like we are just starting analyzing this. We're still running 2 trials of the first part of this project. Hopefully one in Outlook and one here. Need to talk to Gursahib about that. And we need to continue to analyze. We generated most of the data for the genetic part, so I need to start working on doing GWAS analysis for the bean diversity panel, and also QTL analysis for the biparental population. And then we have to analyze everything combined and see how where this takes us. We have done some preliminary QTL analysis, and we might have already some regions responsible, but for time, and also wanted to analyze everything together before presenting anything. So with that, I will finish. I'd like to acknowledge the people from our group, and also thank Gursahib and Gary from ICDC for growing the other sites, and of course funding agencies. With that, I don't know if I have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that excellent presentation. Certainly good to see that a lot of work is going on in the breeding side of things to find varieties that will be well adapted to Saskatchewan conditions. If you do, just a reminder, if you have questions, to type them into the chat in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. The first question is, in the first presentation, you talked about anthracnose as one of the diseases of dry beans. Is that the same anthracnose that's found in lentil, or is it a different strain?
It's a different. I think 73 can definitely infect both, but there will be some strains that will be specific for lentils or specific for beans. And one of the ones that we are definitely interested in pursuing and studying right now is the 105. I understand Kirsten just got funding for that because there is zero resistance so far for that specific race. But there is resistance in other pulls from other breeding groups. So hopefully we can easily bring that into your varieties.
Okay. Another question is the like pod clearance seems to be a real issue with regard to bean production. And what about looking at row spacing? Is that part of the research as well, looking at row spacing and what effect that has on pod clearance?
We mostly focus right now on the so the first agronomic part. What we are doing is playing with the density on the row. We're probably not playing much with the row spacing, basically because it's a little bit complicated to find that. At least in our equipment, we don't have the ability to adjust that much. Even with density, honestly, one of the reasons that we have to run it again this year is because, like last year, the density here wasn't good, and then density in Outlook wasn't good year before. So if we don't get it right, we really have no data. But no, we haven't. We are targeting more playing on the road rather than in between rows.
Okay. Okay. I'm not getting any additional questions right now for you, Anna, but I'm sure there'll be more as the day goes on. So thank you very much again for that presentation. It was excellent information. We really appreciate the work that you're doing here. So thank you for that.
Thank you for giving me the space to present.
Thank you. Up next, we have Chuck Penner. Chuck has an agribusiness diploma and a Bachelor of Science degree in agricultural economics from the University of Manitoba. Chuck founded Left Field Commodity Research in 2010. He has spent nearly 30 years working in the Canadian grain industry, including 5 years as senior consultant in the Canadian Office of Informa Economics, 1 year as the director of marketing strategy for Black Sheep Strategy, 15 years in various roles at United Grain Growers and Agricor United, some shorter stints at Pioneer Grain and the Canadian Wheat Board. He had a few years trying his hand at farming in the late 1980s, right in the drier part of the times. A farmhand, landscaper, waiter, busboy, and camp counselor, and probably a few jobs he has forgotten about. Chuck's no stranger to us. He's spoken in Saskatchewan a number of times. I'm sure many of you know him. He'll be talking about dry bean markets today. So with that, take it away, Chuck, and welcome.
Okay, thanks, Dale. And it's good to be with you. Yeah, one of my first jobs, I would say, sorry, Dale, is my screen showing up okay?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, one of my first couple of jobs were picking picking stumps out of fields, roguing mustard out of pedigreed canola fields on hands and knees. So yeah, I'm intimately involved. That's why I have an office job today, just because well, while those were learning experiences, not ones that I wanted to repeat. So today I'm going to be talking to you about dry bean outlook and some of the things that have been going on in the market. And so I'm hoping to provide some insight there that will help make this this year more of a success. So with that, I'll jump into there we go. Jump into the slides. And so it was interesting to see Dennis's presentation from the Sask crop insurance data. When you look at StatsCan acreage data from 22, it showed that the Saskatchewan dry bean area was 7,200 acres, which is about half of what it was the couple of years before that. But essentially what we had was we've had a long buildup or a buildup in Canadian bean acreage, and that topped out in 2020. We had another strong year in 2021. Of course, that was the drought year. But then in the last year, we dropped off pretty significantly. So down to right around 300,000 acres, which is the lowest that we've had since, well, in about 10 years. And so again, StatsCan was showing Sask bean acres around 7,200. So I guess there's different ways of looking at that, and the crop insurance data was uses different measurements, I suppose. But in any case, the acreage had been increasing. If you go back to the earlier part on this chart, again, Sask dry bean acres were quite small, and then as things built up in the last few years, they rose in accordance with that, and I think topped out around 15,000 acres, something like that, 15 to 20, I believe, in 2020. So that's been the kind of the scenario that we've had, and so that sets the stage for this drop in Canadian acreage, sets the stage for the marketing year that we're in right now. If we break that down, and this is measured in a little different way, so the totals are a little different. So this is a kind of a mashup of StatsCan acres and some provincial crop insurance acres and so on. So we tried to break it down by type. And so the larger declines, so acreage dropped by about a third, and the larger declines were in the white beans. So Great Northerns and Navies were down over 40 to 45%. And so those ones took the biggest hit. Blacks were down the least because we've had a number of years where black bean prices have been quite a bit weaker than the rest of the bean complex. But going into this year, black bean prices had moved higher, and so there was less of a drop off in black bean acreage for 2022. But quite a significant decline. So those were by type. Those were the differences that we've seen. When we look at production, of course, we had, from a Canadian perspective, it was the yields were strong in both Western and Eastern Canada, and so we had a near record yield in 2022, which caused which offsets that 1/3 drop off in seeded area in 2022, and so production ended up around 320,000 tons, 320,000 tons, which was down from 380 the year before. So that's the drop off in production, which wasn't as severe, and so you can actually look at it and say, well, the dry bean crop in Canada was relatively stable, has been relatively stable, other than the big years of 2020 and 2021. So that was the production side, and this is broken down by whites and by coloreds. And just a quick note: there's data in StatsCan that talks about white beans, or sorry, colored beans. I think it throws either Great Northerns or Navies, I forget which one. I think Great Northerns into the colored mix, and I think it's related to bean species, which is not my area of knowledge at all. So I think that's why they do that. So it's a little confusing. Just in terms of the how StatsCan changes its estimates through the year, for dry beans, actually, what we've seen is we had a year in 2021 where there was a huge increase when the December number came out, December production estimate came out. But for the most part, if you look back over these years, there haven't been any revisions or very few revisions between the December estimate and then what the later estimates are a year or two later. Sometimes they'll make further revisions. So I think when we look at a crop of about 320,000 tons for 22, it's probably going to stay close to that type of an estimate. So it's unlikely it'll be adjusted later. So here it shows that the production was down 19%, while acreage was down 30-some% from the year before. When we look at the U.S. side, because of course you have to look at the U.S., it dominates the dry bean picture for Canada as well too. So when we look at, these are the major bean classes in the U.S. and in Canada, and so when we look at these, we see that black bean acreage actually was up slightly in 2022. In Canada, it was only down 9%, less of a drop than other types. Meanwhile, navies dropped 17%. Pintos were only down slightly as well too. So we had just like in Western Canada, there was a great big acreage year in 2020, and then acreage has dropped off from there. But pintos are still the dominant bean class. We also have numbers for some of the minor classes, and so these are acreage in the U.S. And this shows the purple bars are 2021. The green bars are the official USDA numbers, and then the yellow bars are something called the Farm Service Agency data, which is basically the acres that farmers in the U.S. declare to take part in the farm programs that are down there. So most of them are not too different between the green and the yellow. There's a few differences there, but we can see here again for 2022, whichever measure you're looking at, there was a sharp drop in Great Northern acreage and a sharp drop in dark red kidney acreage. And so those were the big swings that we saw this year. Others more variable, a few increases in 2022, and again, depending on which measure you're looking at, but otherwise relatively stable from year to year, other than those big shifts. When we look at the production, and again, these are just the 5 largest classes in the U.S. and the ones that probably concern us the most. What we can see in terms of production, because again, yields were stronger there, is that navy bean production was pretty much unchanged. What you see is that Great Northerns were down, but that was from a bigger year. The big one I want to highlight from here, of course, is pintos. And so you see these huge swings in production from 2017 and then down in 2018, down in 2019, then way up again in 2020, down again sharply in 21, partly drought related, and then rebounding pretty solidly in 22. And so that makes for a very difficult marketing picture in terms of managing those huge variations in supplies. And so we've actually seen some relatively stable pinto bean prices, especially viewed in light of these big swings in production. And so that's the kind of situation we have there. For black beans, we saw a bounce in production in 2022, kidneys down for the second straight year. And so tighter supplies for that class of beans. When we look at it from a North American perspective, so this puts the Canadian and US shares or portions of the production side in perspective. And so you can see how the US is a much larger part of the picture. So the total North American production relatively stable from last year, but Canadian production was down while US production was up. But when we look at over the last 10 years, let's say, we can see that the last 2 years have been kind of at the low end of this recent history. And so the 21-22 drought year was what really drove prices higher. And then there hasn't been a huge production response or a huge production or supply increase, at least from an aggregate perspective. So among the various classes, yes, but from an overall perspective, relatively low supplies again in 22-23. So that's helped provide some of that support that we've seen in dry bean bids. So they've come off last year's highs, but they're certainly historically pretty strong. Just in terms of the Canadian bean supply outlook, and these are my own estimates. It's difficult because StatsCan doesn't measure dry bean stocks, so we're kind of going based on the production, imports, and exports, and trying to figure out what might be domestic use. And so we have tried to bump up domestic use a little bit. I think we've seen increased consumption of dry beans to some degree. So we've tried to bump that up in the last 2 or 3 years. But even so, what it suggests is that we have some pretty comfortable carryovers. That's the purple part of the bars here, carryovers from the last couple of years. And so even though the 22 crop was smaller, supplies didn't drop off all that much because imports were still, well, relatively solid. And just to be clear, a good chunk of those imports are actually dry bean seed for planting. So there's a lot of cross-border trade in planting seed. And then we have the carryover, which again is a guesstimate. Let's put it that way. But it looks like fairly comfortable supplies again. This is something that is actually measured. This is in North Dakota, and so North Dakota is the biggest dry bean producer in the U.S. And so they measure dry bean supplies, and this is as of the end of December. So December 22 is the last number on the chart on the right. And so what we have is in North Dakota record pinto bean supplies of I can't do the conversion to metric in my head, but close to 7 million hundredweight. So that's the kind of the supplies there. Navy beans supplies have also increased from the last 3 years, but black bean supplies are still toward the lower end of recent years, and so relatively more snug for black bean supplies, while pinto bean supplies are quite a bit more comfortable. When we look at our Canadian exports this year so far, we started off very low, very slow, and of course part of that was August, September, and even going into October, where we didn't really have all of the new crop available, and so you can see that exports were smaller, below average, or low to below average in that first quarter, and even November was disappointing. But we really have bounced back nicely in December and January, and so some of those increases have happened with more exports to some places that we wouldn't have thought of, and that includes to Japan as being one of them. Then we've also shipped more into Latin America, which tends to be, and I'll show you a chart. The next chart will show that a little bit more. But those have been some of the pleasant surprises so far this year. And again, you see the green part of the bar is other, and it's a fairly big part of the class. It's some planting seeds and some things that don't get categorized specifically as certain types, but yeah, we've seen a nice pickup, and the gray bars on the right half of the chart is essentially our projection for exports through the rest of the year. And so we do have supplies to do a little bit more than that. We tend to be a little more cautious on that. Hopefully we'll be pleasantly surprised and exports will show up to be stronger in the rest of the year. These are over the last number of years where most of our beans go. So as you can see, the big destinations are the US, of course, and Europe. And Europe is more so white beans being exported there. That includes the UK, but it also includes places like Italy and I'm trying to remember some of the others. But the UK would be the big one, and those would largely be white beans. So we have that type of a setup. But again, this year we're seeing a little bit more to the purple bars are Asia, and then Latin America is the orange bars there. And so we're seeing some increases there. So we're looking at a relatively steady export outlook for this year. And there's some signs that we might be too pessimistic with our export outlook for the rest of this year, and we'll go through those in a second. Just want to show you a slide of some U.S. exports to Mexico. So Mexico is one of the U.S.'s main destinations as well too. So these are exports over the last bunch of years, and it's the main classes. But what you had was when the U.S. had a big crop in 2020, it allowed for some very, very large exports to Mexico. And then of course it had a drought although not everywhere where the US produces beans, but Mexican demand really dropped off quite significantly in 21-22. And it's only starting to pick up again now, and really still not anywhere close to those highs that we saw in 2021. Now, supplies are lower as well too, so we'll keep a lid on those to some degree, but it's positive now that we're seeing more exports into Mexico. And so now the next couple of slides are talking more about Mexico. So this slide shows the Mexican summer bean crop. So typically, well, it's grown in summer, as the name suggests. But what we saw was in 2022, that the crop itself was down by about a quarter. Acreage was lower. Yields, I think, were, if I remember correctly, pretty close to average. But the production was one of the lowest over the last 10 years. And the summer bean crop is roughly about, I'm going to say 70 to 75% of Mexican production happens in the summer crop. And so the fact that its production the summer crop was down was one of the first signals that Mexico might need more beans. The next crop though is the one that is planted now, and so acreage is down quite significantly at the lowest actually in the last 10 years, and production would be, even based on an average yield, would be down a little over 20%. So again, one of the smaller crops that they've had in the last 10 years. And so the issue is, okay, well, that's based on average yields, but when we look at the crop conditions in kind of the northwestern parts of the country where a lot of the beans are grown, this is the satellite vegetation images, or the crop condition maps, or whatever you want to call them, and it shows in those areas that many of them are worse than normal. The vegetation, the crop vegetation is worse than normal, and they have had a very dry winter season, which is their drier part of the year, but it's been much drier than usual. And so if I just go back to this slide, this outlook for a 20% drop in the winter crop is based on average yields. There's a good chance that yields will not be average, and so it raises the potential for even stronger Mexican imports of beans. And typically they'll pull more of them from the US. Canada doesn't tend to be a large supplier. And I'm trying to recall now if the US has some tariff advantages over Canada. I'll have to go back into my records and see what that is. But generally what happens is that Mexico takes beans mostly from the US, but then that causes a supply shortage in the US. So then Canada benefits, even if not indirectly from that type of move. And so all of these issues related to the Mexican crop has resulted in this type of a price move. So in the beginning of last year, I was talking about the summer crop, prices were edging slightly higher, but really it wasn't until later summer that those prices really started to take off in response to that. And it's just continued to go up. The last week or two, it's corrected to some degree, but still very, very high prices for Mexican beans. A couple of things also in this chart is that we see the black bean prices again have been pretty subdued prior to this year, but this year even black bean prices are far beyond those highs that we had of a couple of years ago. Pinto bean prices are close to the extreme highs that we've had there, and then Flor de Mayo, which is a yellow bean type, at record levels as well too. So this reflects the supply tightness in Mexico. So that's one of the reasons why I say we may see stronger Canadian exports in the months ahead if we have this type of situation where Mexico is really importing at a heavier pace. So that's room for optimism for the Canadian side anyway. Looking further south, we go into Argentina. And so Argentina beans are generally produced kind of in the northwest of the country. And I'm sure you've seen all kinds of headlines about extreme drought in Argentina, and that is more related to the core growing areas in the southeast of the country. That's where it's the worst. But even in the dry bean areas, what I would say is that those crops there are threatened as well, and yields with the crop being harvested in the next couple of months, yields could see a hit. Dry bean yields could see a hit there as well too. And so there's Argentina tends to export into surrounding countries in South America, and particularly to Brazil. And so that's if Argentina has a smaller crop, then that provides for less surplus that can go into the surrounding countries. And so again, Canada could see some benefits of that. Argentine dry bean exports are largely alubias, white beans, and then black beans. Those are the two big exports there, with some they call them Colorados, some red beans as well too. When we look at their exports over the last number of months, so again, these are black, the negro, alubia, and otros is mainly the red beans, and so we see the volumes after the last harvest didn't reach the peaks that we had in the last 3 years. So that's kind of the after harvest seasonal spike. Well, the spike didn't get very large, although there has been steadier exports since then. But it's a suggestion that even last year's crop, the 22 crop, wasn't all that large. And then now we're coming into 23, where the crop could be small again. So it would raise the issue that Argentina will have less beans available to export going into 23 and 24. So again, if Canada can capitalize on some of that, that will help draw down our stocks with larger exports in the coming months. When we look at bean bids in Western Canada, we don't have very many of them. So if anybody has a source of dry bean bids, a weekly source, please get in touch with me. I'd love to add more to our mix. But anyway, this is what we have. So what we had is you saw the prices starting to rise already in earlier in 2021, and then we hit the drought, and that's when prices really hit their highs, where black and pinto beans were exceptionally strong in the high 50s. Navy beans didn't quite get to those highs, and then when we get into the 22-23 year, so August of 22, there you see the bigger pinto bean crop that we talked about really start to weigh on the market. So pinto bean prices dropped off while blacks and navies managed to hold on to most of the strength that they had even in 21, 22. So that's the variability in those kind of price behaviors or price responses based on a bigger pinto bean crop and pinto bean supplies. But even then, if you look back, if you compare where current bids are compared to prior to the drought, still looking relatively strong. In the US, we've also seen a similar type of a move where pinto bean bids have dropped off more. And even in the last little bit, we've seen black bean and navy bean bids decline in the US. But generally, again, compared to before the 21 drought, prices still relatively strong. And so that we're not sure what that's going to do in terms of acreage for next year. But just to put a little bit more perspective around some of these prices, I want to the next couple slides show some pinto and some black bean prices over the longer haul. So again, we can see where prices are with a better perspective. Anyway, some little bit of that. So these are US bids, so these are in US dollars per hundredweight. And so what we have is prices there generally in and around the $35 per hundredweight or 35 cents a pound. And that's again well off the highs of the drought year, but still very much in if you talk about what are the top third, bottom third, middle third of prices, still in that top third of prices. We've been there before. We've had prices this high in the past, but this year's prices are still relatively strong, especially in light of that slide that I showed of North Dakota pinto bean record supplies inventories of pinto beans this year. So relatively strong given that. So I guess that's something to be something that's a little more positive. This next chart shows the same thing, but for black beans. And again, definitely in that top third and even closer to the historical highs that we've had. So again, in US dollars, prices around on either side of $40 US per hundredweight. And that's quite strong from a historical perspective. And yes, we've been $5 or a little bit more higher at times, but in those times generally there's almost no black beans available for sale. So it doesn't really reflect what beans are trading at. But anyway, so these kind of price for pintos and for blacks, these kind of longer term prices in my mind are still point to a strong market for dry beans. And again, if we have some stronger demand from Mexico and from other Latin American countries in the last few months of this year, we could even see a little bit of a bump yet in prices going into the late stages of this year. Just in terms of where we think things could go this year, we're calling for a small increase in seeded area for 23, and we're always open to other ideas and opinions about where acreage is going to go. But because we have some pretty historically strong prices again, I think there's room for acres to bounce back a little bit to 325, maybe even up to 350,000 acres. And if we have kind of average yields, which is the best odds at this for a guess at this time of year, we'll end up with a little bit larger crop again in 23. So that's kind of the picture. And when I look at relative prices between the various classes, I would say we probably could see a bit more acreage increases in the area of black beans, maybe a bit of a drop off in pintos. Other minor classes are looking very strong. So there too, we could see some increases in acres. So that's kind of a guesstimate at this point of the year. So we'll be very curious to see how that unfolds in the next couple of months once once farmers get into the field. When we look at just a few slides about faba beans, I thought I would throw a few of these in just because they sort of relate. What we had is we had a huge drop in faba bean seeded area, almost 60% lower than in 21. And a good chunk of that, I would say, was related to planting delays, especially on the eastern prairies, northeast Saskatchewan, where there is kind of a pocket of faba bean production. I think that's where part of that acreage loss occurred. But in general, we had some very, very low acreage, the lowest that we've had going back to 2013, when faba beans were starting to become more of a picture. The positive thing, though, is that we had some yields that were right back in that average kind of a range. And so what we had is production of about 90,000, just under 90,000 tons, which is a nice increase over last year. So the increase in yields more than offset the drop in acres. And so production was still at the lower end of the last number of years. So a relatively tight supply. And the issue with faba beans, of course, as many of you know, is this trying to find some domestic use. One of the issues or concerns is that we have still lots of competition from some key faba bean exporters. So France, not so much, but the UK, Australia, and the Baltic countries, which are Lithuania, Latvia, those kind of countries. And so Canada made some real headway in the export market, but a few years ago, but that's when production was sharply lower in these other countries, including Australia and the UK. So that's where Canada was able to step in. But now that this competition has ramped back up again, it makes that quite difficult. And so when we look at faba bean exports this year, that's the black line with the yellow dots there. It's really lagged even compared to last year, the last 2 years, where supplies were low and we still had lots of competition. So and there may be some quality issues related to that as well too, especially with planting being pushed later. But it's been a real challenge. So what this tells us is that for faba beans to expand and thrive in Canada, we're going to have a hard time doing that through the export market, and we'll really need to focus on the domestic side. So I know there are moves being made to increase or to build some domestic processing production, and I really think that's where we need to go. And I am a fan of fabas. I think there's a real place for them in Western Canada, in the whole mix of pulses and so on. And so when we just one other slide related to fabas. So this shows bids over the last few years, and again, what we can see is that faba bean prices have really been closely linked to feed pea prices in particular, and to a lesser extent edible yellows. And again, we don't have a tremendous number of faba bean bids, so this is a mix of both food and feed quality. So that green line is a mix of those two classes, but still quite closely linked to what goes on in the feed side. So that's been it's benefited from that in the last in 21, 22, and then it hasn't really been able to take off again in the more recent years because of a bit of a cap from pea prices, from feeds and from edible yellows. So just to kind of sum up on the dry bean outlook, to summarize some of the charts and the points, we had this large drop in Canadian acreage in 22, but that was offset by these stronger yields. So some comfortable supplies, or steady supplies, maybe put it that way, a bigger U.S. crop, and especially on the pinto side, those supplies seem to be heavy. I would say prices are stronger than what I would have expected based on the bigger U.S. supplies, but I'm I'm really wondering and don't have a good way of measuring domestic use, domestic consumption of dry beans. And I would love to find a way to measure that. But at this point, I have the feeling that domestic use has increased, which is a great thing because that's some of your strongest demand. But as to how much that actually is, or a pretty close estimate of that, really difficult to say. We have concerns about both the Mexican and the Argentine dry bean crops, and that should or could shift, well, I would say should shift demand toward the US and to Canada. And so what we might see over the next little bit is some seasonal moves, and prices dry bean bids do tend to drop off once we get close to the next harvest looking like it's made, or close to it anyway. And so we could see some drop offs there, but otherwise steady and maybe even a bit higher if that Latin American demand really kicks in. So with that, I thank you. I'll turn it back over to Dale, and we'll see if there's any questions about that.
Great. Thanks very much, Chuck, for that excellent presentation, and give us a really good glimpse as to what's going on in the bean market. And that's always good to know when you're thinking about what sort of crops you want to grow from one year to the next. And I just want to apologize for the map that I gave to Dennis that you kind of alluded to earlier on, because that's a crop insurance map. So it just basically shows crop acres that are insured by SCIC. And I don't know for sure, but I don't think, like, because most of our beans in Saskatchewan are grown under irrigation, the cost benefit ratio might be different, and so maybe a lot of them are not even insured because of that factor. But and I guess the other thing too is, like I think Dennis alluded to, the competition from other crops sometimes being an influence, and he talked about soybean influencing the dry bean acres, and I think here we've probably experienced that with just about everything compared to what happened with canola acres. So so that may have been a factor as well. So I'm sorry for that. I think your numbers are probably pretty accurate though, because there's certainly
Well, yeah, there's wiggle room on both sides. So, I wouldn't want to get hung up on one or the other. But and there might be some other acres in areas outside of those districts, some smaller acres that are not showing up because of confidentiality issues or things like that. So there could be a bit of that too.
yeah. And you talked about buyers in Canada. Like, are we quite low in the number of buyers for dry beans in Canada, or what's the story there? Where are they located if they are? Is it mostly Alberta?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dale. The main buyers are, of course, in southern Manitoba, and for the western part of the business. And what we've seen in the last few years is that the Ontario buyers, because that's the other big chunk of production is in Ontario, the Ontario buyers have bought out or merged with some Western buyers. So I don't know that we've seen any increase or decrease in that. And then when you get into Alberta, there's kind of a grower group there where they grow a lot of those white beans for, a lot of that is shipped. I'm going back to my UGG Agricor days, but where there was a lot of that was shipped off to the UK. So it was a group of production there. I don't think there's many other buyers in Alberta. I think most of them would be southern Manitoba and especially the Red River Valley.
Okay. The faba beans you talked to about, I guess there are some markets being developed, different companies and that, but it's kind of it's interesting that those numbers haven't gone up. But I know there was a big discussion this year about the new types that have a lower visine, convisine content, and that might change things too in the coming years. I think. What are your thoughts on that? Because of that.
Yeah, I think so.
So.
Yeah, the faba bean situation has really been a chicken and egg thing, right? Or a catch-22. We need the processors to to process so that we have this ready market, but they have a hard time building something if there isn't supplies there. So it's a bit of a thing that's hard to generate. But I do think the low visine varieties and that are the next stage in that market development that will allow expansion. We do have, I'm getting bits and pieces of interest from processors, not even necessarily in Canada, well, some from Canada, but also from the US, where the US company asking me about, can we get a few hundred tons to run a test batch or things like that. So I think there's stuff happening. And while we know there is some movement, let's but largely our exports have been to the U.S. lately. There's been a little bit to a few other countries. Egypt comes and goes depending on whether from these other exporters or whether we have supplies from there or not. But largely our export market has been the U.S. already. So between some processors here and maybe some process interest in the U.S., I think there is room for that to grow. I think there's lots of interest I sense from farmers who are looking for another pulse to include in their mix, and because FABAs have some advantages that way. So yeah, I think the potential is there. I think it might be another year or two before we see that start to have a more noticeable impact.
Okay, thanks. So with regard to like market and market impact, is the U.S. the biggest producer, or is Argentina bigger? Like which one is kind of the major competition for production in the world?
Well, from a dry bean perspective, Argentina the U.S. would be a larger producer. I'm just trying to do them, remember my spreadsheets in my head, which is always a dangerous thing. But the U.S. would be the larger factor that affects us anyway. And that's because they're also exporting to Europe, which we are. They're also exporting into Mexico, which we have been trying to do as well too. So we're competing with them a little more directly than we would be with Argentina. Argentina largely exports to Brazil and then some other surrounding countries, which we often don't have access to, or we rarely export large volumes to. So, but if there's a shortfall, and we've seen this, I think it was in 2017, where the Argentine crop was really small, then the shortfalls in South America got big enough that it started to draw down North American beans into South America. So I don't think we're quite at that stage, but we could see some of that demand from South America and maybe Mexico pull in more Canadian beans, more U.S. beans, and more Canadian beans, which will help draw down these supplies by the end of this year.
Yeah, that kind of leads to the next question, like who is Canada's largest export country? Like which country do we export the most to typically?
It would be the U.S. And that's a real mix. Again, I'm not sure if I said or not, but in the presentation, there's a lot of cross-border trade both ways, but a lot of that is planting seed, which is still large volumes. When you add it up against the rest of the trade, it's actually a significant volume. But the U.S. is our largest buyer. The U.K. would be second, and that is largely for white beans. Though that tends to go into their canning industry. And then other European countries, I would say, would be sizable. Italy. Trying to remember the others. We also export some into Africa. Uganda is a significant buyer at times. And then a couple of the interesting ones this year were Japan for some small red beans, and again, trying to do this from memory. And then a little bit more we're starting to pick up into Latin America, and I'm trying to remember the countries specifically. Might have been Peru, But some volumes into Latin America are just starting to pick up now. So again, that's a positive sign, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned the Japan, and I think it was red beans that they were looking for, because I think I actually saw some of that come across my desk where they were wanting to buy red beans from Saskatchewan. I don't think we grow many red beans in Saskatchewan, so I'm not sure what happened there, some marketing direction or whatever. But what beans tend to be the dominant ones that Canada exports? Are they pintos or?
Yeah, the main classes that we grow would also be the main export ones. So pintos, navies, Great Northerns to some degree, and then blacks. So pintos and blacks, the largest two, and then these other ones. The red beans, the small red beans that Japan is looking for, I think those are mainly grown in Ontario. So that's where they. It used to be a few years ago, China was a significant exporter of beans into other Asian countries, and because of emphasis on producing major crops like rice and corn and wheat, a bunch of minor crops, production of a bunch of minor crops in China has really contracted. So China is really not in fact, they're an importer now of beans. They used to be a sizable exporter of black beans, but they would export into surrounding countries. And so that presence has disappeared as well too, which has been beneficial for dry beans. I think if it's been a few years since I've looked at this, but I think if you look at as an aggregate global trade in pulses, in dry beans and in peas, lentils, and chickpeas, I believe dry bean trade dominates, actually, is the largest class of exports versus peas even, or lentils, which we tend to think of as being the big ones. I think dry beans are actually the largest class of trade, and a lot of that happens in and around those Asian markets.
Yeah. Well, I guess we don't have any more questions lined up here, but thanks again, Chuck, for that excellent presentation. And I think I'm hoping you'll stay on as one of the panelists as well, in case we have more questions as time goes on here. We've got 2 presenters left, and so I guess we'll move on right now then to our next one, that is Gursahib Singh, who will be speaking about 4 dry bean projects that he's worked on. Gursahib is currently the ICDC Research Director out at Outlook, and has been with ICDC for 2 years and manages the ICDC Research Program. Gursahib graduated from the U of S in Saskatoon in 2021 with a PhD in plant sciences. He focused on cereal diseases at that time, but now he's handling the dry bean side of things. So with that, Gursahib, take it away. You're on.
Dale, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Looks like I'm the only novice presenter here talking about the dry beans. But previous research director of ICDC, Gary Natovich, he did a lot of research and left me with some good results to talk about in the presentation today. So for today's presentation, I would be focusing on 4 projects, which we carried out, or Gary carried out at ICDC in the last few years. The first one was we compare narrow row production to the wide row production for dry beans. This was a 3-year study. Then we started a tillage and a seeding date study in 2020 and 2021. Then a dry bean inoculant study and fertilizer strategies for solid seed production. And lastly, we just finished an ADF 3-year ADF study focused on nitrogen fertilization of irrigated dry beans. So dry bean, as everyone talked about, dry bean production in Saskatchewan has remained relatively constant over the years in Saskatchewan. Over the year in Saskatchewan, and predominantly under irrigation, dry bean is a high value commodity and can provide high economic returns, and often more profitable than canola making it an attractive pulse crop. If anyone is interested to know the exact number or the net profit of growing dry beans, please refer to the ICDC crop economics and agronomic guides. We publish this annually in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture, and it could be found on the ICDC website. Dry bean acres under irrigations usually vary between 8 to 12% within the Lake Diefenbaker development area, which include Riverhurst, Lucky Lake, and SSRID. Some benefits of growing dry beans, like other pulse crops, it's another pulse crop option to widen the crop rotation, break the disease cycle of cereals and canola pathogens, and being a pulse crop, it will help improve the yields of the following crop. From the disease point of view, dry beans are not as susceptible to phenomyces as peas and lentils and can be substituted for peas and lentils in rotation where phenomyces is a concern. Under irrigation, dry beans are grown using wide row cropping system and usually need specialized harvest equipments. On the other hand, under dryland conditions in the region with adequate rainfall, a solid seeded production system has been promoted so that the farmers can grow dry beans with their conventional farming equipments, and which will eventually expand the dry bean acreages in Saskatchewan. Since narrow row production has been promoted in the last few years, ICDC staff, along with the Ministry of Agriculture staff and the researcher at the University of Saskatchewan, compared the potential of narrow row spacings versus the traditional wide row spacing in irrigated dry bean production. So as I mentioned earlier, this was a 3-year study started in 2016, 2017, and 2018, funded through ADOPT. It's the Ministry of Agriculture funding. So here we were comparing the wide row production to the narrow row production. The wide row spacing was 24 inches, comparing to 8 to 12 inches row spacing in the narrow row. Target plant population, it was 25 for the wide row and 35 plants per square meter for the narrow row. So in this study, we had 6 varieties, 2 for each market class of pinto beans, black beans, and navy beans. And ultimately, at the end, just to evaluate the treatment effect, we looked at the yield test with flowering time, maturity, lodging, pod clearance, height, and plant stand. For today's presentation, I would be just focusing on the yield results. For the 3-year, what we saw was the yield, it was higher for the narrow row production as compared to the wide row production. There was difference in yield between the 6 varieties, but I won't be talking about that. So this results, a report was written and submitted to the ministry, and it was also included in the ICDC R&D report, which are on the ICDC website. If you want to know more about this project, please refer to that report, and if you have a question, you can get back to me. Moving on to the second project, which was focused on dry bean tillage and seeding date. Dry bean is a warm season crop and with an apical germination. As you can see here in the photo, with the apical germination means that the cotyledons, they are pushed out of the ground and they are favored by warm soil conditions. Germination and emergence are enhanced when soil temperatures are 15 to 16 degrees. And at this temperature, you will start noticing the soil crack and the emergence in generally 7 days. And as the temperature drops below 15 and 16 degrees Celsius and to 12 degrees Celsius, the time to emergence is extended and the plants are less vigor. So picking the right time of seeding is crucial here, but the problem with the dry bean is that it's very sensitive to the spring and the fall frost. Thus, seeding early and too late can be problematic. Tillage is a common practice, and it's very common in wide row dry bean production under irrigation. So the idea here for the tillage is the soil warms quicker with the tillage and benefit the dry bean emergence and germination. However, we all know that tillage disregard the best management practice in some situation and also add additional expenses. As the interest in dry bean production in suitable dryland areas of Saskatchewan increases, knowing the right seeding time for solid seeded system is important, and it needed investigation. So we know that the soil and drag seeding systems are slower to warm, but the question is whether light tillage will benefit and facilitate dry bean production, or alternatively, the only option is the dry bean seeding date can be delayed until soils are approximately warm without endangering the maturity and the harvest. So this study, it was funded through the SFP program. So we have a ministry lead on this. The ministry lead on this project is Morgan Cote. She's an soils agrologist at the Outlook branch. This study started in 2021. So we already have 2 years of data, and we would be replicating the trial again in 2023. So the objective of this study was to evaluate different stubble management practices and see how they impact the emergence, plant stands, and seed yield. For the stubble management practices, we followed heavy tillage. So the treatments we followed were heavy tillage, comparing it to medium tillage, and then the no tillage. For the heavy tillage, we used a rotatil, and the soil was blackened, and then harrow-packed. For the medium tillage, we just used a cultivator, and for the no tillage, the dry beans were planted right into the standing stubble. The second objective of this study was the seeding date and how that impact the emergence, plant stand, and seed yield. So we were targeting 3 seeding dates, May 10, May 21st, and June 1st. That's like 10 days apart. And then for this experiment, it was solid seeded, and the variety we used was blackstrap, CDC blackstrap, and it was used in all the in the previous 2 years, and we plan to use the same variety in the next year. Blackstrap, as Anna also mentioned in her presentation, it's well adapted for Saskatchewan and has been promising performance in solid seeded strain combined dryland production. So this is how the heavy tillage looked like. This is ICD's technician on a tractor with the rototiller, and this video just show how the heavy tillage treatment looked like. Moving on to the results. So first part, the tillage. We talked about how tillage impacted the yield. For this presentation, as we have times limited, so I would just highlight the yield results from 2021 and 2022. And what we saw was in 2021, there wasn't any advantage of heavy tillage over no-till. Like all the treatments or the yield between these 3 treatments, they were not statistically different. But the story in 2022, it was somewhat different. We saw that heavy tillage did have some advantage. I had a mistake here. It should be B instead of A. So the heavy tillage did have an advantage over the medium tillage and no tillage. Our yields, they were lower in 2022 as compared to 2021. 2022, we moved, this trial was set up on a new land where we didn't have any history, so that might have accounted to the lower yield in 2022. The second objective was the seeding date. Our targeted seeding dates in 2021, it was May 10th, May 19th, and June 1st. In 2022, we started the first seeding on May 10th and May 21st and June 1st. And what we saw was as we delayed the seeding, there was yield advantage. Again, June 1st seeding date had higher yield as compared to May 19th or May 21st, and versus the May 10th seeding dates. And at all the 3 seeding dates, we also looked at the soil temperature, and the idea here was to see whether delayed seeding or tillage would impact the soil temperature and ultimately affect the crop emergence. And what we saw was that soil temperature, it varied with seeding dates, but the tillage had no tillage treatment, heavy, medium, and no till. The temperature was almost the same at all the 3 seeding sites. So this study, it will be repeated again in 2023, and that would be the end of the study. And then I would start working on the final report, and the final report would be up on the ICDC website. Moving on, as we heard on this webinar, that dry beans, they don't respond well to inoculants. So the question is, should we inoculate the dry beans or just fertilize? Inoculation of pulse crop is widely acceptable as a sound agronomic practices. However, dry beans are less effective at fixing nitrogen than peas, faba beans, and lentils. And as you can see here in the bar graph, dry beans can generally expect to fix around half of their nitrogen requirement from fixation, depending on the environmental conditions. And generally, dry bean inoculants are less popular, and only a few products are available, which usually contain a mixture of strains, and the most effective strain will form a symbiosis with the roots, and again, efficacy would depend upon the environmental conditions. In 2019, ICDC led a project with the objective to evaluate the potential of solid-seeded dry bean production under dryland conditions in non-irrigated area. And the second objective was focused on to evaluate the commercial inoculants alone and in combination with the nitrogen fertilizers. So this project, again, it was funded through ADOPT. The sites included one irrigated site, which was ICDC Outlook, and we had 4 dryland sites. So all these 4, these are aggregam sites at Scott, Redwoods, Yorkton, and Indian Head. So the idea of the objective, one of the objective was to compare the dryland dry bean production to irrigated production. Second part of the objective was the inoculant. So we compared the peat-based inoculant and granular inoculants to the granular inoculants with and without addition of fertilizer nitrogen. And the nitrogen fertilizer rates we were targeting were like 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and that include soil nitrogen plus the fertilizer nitrogen. The variety we used was blackstrap, CTC blackstrap. The plant population for this trial, it was set at, or the target plant population was set at 35 plants per meter square, and the row spacing it varied between aggregam sites based on the equipment. Moving on to the results, what we found that overall this study demonstrated that it is viable to grow dry bean under dryland conditions utilizing the solid-seeded production system. And the second part of the study, which was focused on inoculants. So up on the screen, I have the results for the inoculants part, how they impacted the yield. And what we saw was the inoculant failed to provide yield or agronomic benefits to dry beans in the trials. However, applying fertilizer nitrogen did increase the grain yield and tend to provide taller plants, making the straight combine easier. So now we know that the inoculants, they are not in picture for dry bean production. So knowing the right fertilizer recommendations, nitrogen fertilizer rates, it's very important. And what we know for Saskatchewan is like dry bean nitrogen fertilizer rates, they are based upon a suggested rate determined by fertilizer and applied per soil test available, and in the upper 2 fields should be equal to 80 pounds of N per acre. This rate or recommendation, they closely follow the Alberta irrigated dry bean fertilizer recommendations of having 80 to 100 pound of N per acre in 0 to 12 inches. 12 inches, which include the fertilizer plus the soil available N. And for Manitoba and Ontario, the recommendations, the oldest, so these are the oldest recommendation I saw. But there is a new study, as we heard on this webinar, there are ongoing studies in Manitoba, and so these recommendations could change. But for the information I have, so 80 kg per hectare of N is recommended, and again, it's the soil available N plus fertilizer. So in the most recent recommendation, they are from North Dakota, so they were updated in 2023. And the new recommendation, according to the new recommendation for the irrigated dry beans, 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre is recommended. And it is also instructed to split the applications as a as a small pre-plant application of 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre, supplemented with the first application as a side rest before vining, and then subsequent application of nitrogen through the irrigation system before the top pod fill begins. So keeping this in mind, like most of the recommendation, there wasn't any study in Saskatchewan done directly for the dry beans. So the recommendations, there was just the anecdotal claims from the researchers or the farmers. So there was need to revisit the nitrogen fertilization recommendations for dry beans, irrigated dry beans in Saskatchewan. And keeping that in mind, ICDC staff, they designed a study with the objective to determine nitrogen fertilizer rate, yield response for pinto market class under irrigated wide row dry bean production system. And the second part of the study was we were using two nitrogen sources, the ESN and the commercial urea, and we just wanted to see that whether ESN nitrogen fertilizer is more beneficial as compared to the commercial urea as a fertilizer source for irrigated dry beans. So this study, it was a 3-year study. We had two nitrogen sources, conventional urea and ESN. The fertilizer rates, they were increment of 30. The lowest rate we had was 30, 60, 90, 120, and the highest was 150. So this was a total of N available in the 30 centimeter of the soil plus fertilizer N. And the trials, they were not inoculated throughout the study. So trials were carried out in 2019. Trials were not established in 2020 due to global pandemic, but postponed to 2021 and 2022. Each year we had 3 individual sites, in total 9 sites over 3 years. In 2019, the pinto market class dry bean variety we used was CDC White Mountain 2. But we replaced this to a newer variety in 2021 and 2022, which was White Mountain 3. The seeding rate of the seed rate for this trial was 30 seeds per meter squared at a 50 centimeter row spacing, and all trials were seeded after the May long weekend. At the R2 stage, R2 growth stage, which is the early pod initiation stage, plant samples were collected for the estimation of the fresh and the dry biomass weight, and we also submitted the sample to AgWise laboratories to estimate the total N uptake in the tissue. At all trials, we did a soil testing in the spring before seeding. The soil test nitrogen levels, they range from 13 to 47 kg of N per hectare, and they averaged at 60 kg N per hectare in the upper 30 centimeter depth, and the average was 58 kg of N per hectare in the 0 to 60 centimeter depth. So moving on to the results. So for today, we'll be just talking about a few of the parameters we measured in the study. So I would start with the yield response to the nitrogen fertilizer and then the nitrogen fertilizer sources. So these results are from the 3 sites, from 3 years of this study across 8 sites. One of the study, it had high CV, so that site was not included in the final data analysis. And what we saw was dry bean seed response was only marginal from 30 to 90 kg per hectare of N rates, and dry bean yield did not respond statistically to N rates until additional 120 or 150 kg of N per hectare applications. The unfertilized or the control plot, the seed yield was high. The average yield across the three years, it was 2,900 kg per hectare, which is approaching the average fertilizer dry-bin yield of 3,000 kg per hectare for irrigated dry-bin production within the Lake Diefenbaker region. Between control and the 120 kg N per hectare application, the yield increase was 11%. The second objective was to see the yield responses to ESN and urea, and what we saw was between the two fertilizer products, dry-bin yield response was higher for ESN as compared to the commercial urea. Moving on, as I mentioned, we did the fresh biomass and the dry biomass for this study, and similar to the yield, plant biomass, fresh and dry weight were also marginally influenced by the first three treatments, and it did increase at the 120 and 150, and it was not statistically different from one another. Similar to yield responses, what we saw was the biomass for dry bean, it was higher for ESN as compared to the urea. As previously mentioned, we did the tissue N uptake and we submitted the samples to AgWise laboratories. And what we saw was the control 30, 60, and 90 kg of N treatments, they were not statistically different. Even the 120, it was comparable to the control. And the only difference we saw for the N uptake was when 150 kg of N was applied, whereas the N uptake did not vary between the ESN and urea. And lastly, we estimate the total N uptake by the tri-bean, and as you can see, the control plot had 90 kg of N uptake, even if we considered the soil available N in the upper 60 centimeter, as I showed in the previous slide. The average was 58 kg of N per hectare. It is unlikely that this amount plus mineralization could have resulted in the 90 kg of N per hectare uptake obtained in the control plots. Normally in an N rate study, you would see a visual N fertilizer response throughout the growing season, but our study lacked any visual response. Therefore, we feel like biological N fixation must be contributing to the N supply of at least the unfertilized application. Assessing biological N fixation wasn't within the scope of this study, but plants from the control plots, they were annually assessed for nodule present, and what we saw was nodules were absorbed on all the plant roots excavated. Picture here show. So this is from the 2021 trials that were set on the CSIDC station, and as you can see here, there are nodules present on the control plant. And the second picture here is the nodules for their blood rad, which means they were actively fixing N. And as mentioned previously, none of these plots they were not inoculated, and they had no commercial inoculum applied in the last 10 years of this study. So nodule present must have resulted from the infection of the indigenous Rhizobium species specific to dry beans. We saw the same thing in 2022. These pictures are from the Nutridge field. So this was the new land ICDC acquired in 2020. So this land had no previous history of dry beans in the last 40 years. So, but again, we saw a lot of nodules present on in all the plants we excavated, and the presence of nodules on the control treatment was found in all the trials across all the trials in 2022. Most of plants' roots did have greater than 5 nodules, and many were profuse. One thing we noticed was nodule did appear to be reduced in treatment receiving supplemental and fertilizers. At the end of this study, the key messages or the take-home messages for nitrogen fertigation or fertilization of dry bean is what we saw was CDC White Mountain 3 pinto bean failed to respond to the fertilizer addition until high N soil plus fertilizer, which equal to 120 kg of N per hectare, was available, and the additional available N did not provide any further yield increases. CDC White Mountain 3 unfertilized and uninoculated plant formed a symbiosis with indigenous rhizobia by actively fixing nodules on the plant roots, often in abundance. And in the end, it is assumed that biological and fixation in control plant was sufficient to optimize seed yield. As numerous pinto bean varieties are available up in the market, producers should consider adopting a traditional practice of applying fertilizer and such that fertilizer and applied plus soil test equal to 60 to 80 pounds of N per acre. With that, I would conclude my presentation. So most of this work, it was done by Gary Natwich, but I had so the results were shared by Gary Natwich, and there were other collaborators who also helped us with this project, staff from Ministry of Agriculture and researcher from CDC. So I want to acknowledge all their help. ICDC staff and CSIDC staff helped a lot throughout these studies. So I want to acknowledge all their hard work, including the summer students we had over the 3 years, over the last few years of these studies. And lastly, most of the funding for the project I discussed today, it was through the Canadian Agriculture Partnership, funded through ADOPT, SFP, and EDF. With that, I will take on if there are any questions for me. And also, like as I mentioned previously, most of these projects, they are concluded, except the tillage study or the seeding date study. And the results are available on the ICDC website in our R&D report. And if you have any questions or needed further clarification, give me a call. You can see my number up on the screen along with my email.
Well, thank you very much, Gursahib. That was very interesting stuff going on there that you've been looking at. Just I guess some of your projects continue into 2023. Is that right as well out at ICDC? Or
yeah, it's still at ICDC, and the only one left, which we haven't concluded from the 4 I discussed today, was the tillage and the seeding date. But we will be replicating that in 2023.
Great. I think that we're getting kind of late in the day here. We have one speaker left, so maybe in the interest of time, maybe just I'll limit this to one question for you, and that is, how was the nitrogen applied in the application of N to these dry beans? Like, was it?
So everything was side banded in this trial, so right at the seeding, so there wasn't any different technique in applying nitrogen fertilizer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's like I say, excellent presentation and really interesting stuff. So thank you very much for that. And maybe at the end we'll entertain a few more questions as well. We might have some time for that. But right now, I think I'd like to move on to our final speaker for the day, and that is Jeff Ewen. Jeff has his degree in agriculture, majoring in agronomy from the University of Saskatchewan in 2012. He spent 5 years as an irrigation agrologist based out of Outlook for the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture from 2013 to 2018. Jeff is a 4th generation irrigation dryland farmer at Riverhurst, Saskatchewan, and co-owner operator of Alloy Ag, custom row cropping and specializing in dry beans. So take it away, Jeff, and welcome. Good to see you again.
Yes, no, thank you very much. And I appreciate having the opportunity to present. And also, I guess I'll make motion that I have collaborated with many of the panelists, as you'll notice in my presentation. There's some overlap here, but I think we're gonna make it pretty clear what you need to consider when if you want to grow some dry beans in Saskatchewan. So just a summary of what I'm going to cover here. So some production methods, so a couple different ways that we've been doing it in Saskatchewan, classes and varieties for consideration, field considerations, planting, harvest management, storage considerations, and then a little bit on marketing. So production methods, and you'll just hear me as I move along here, I refer to it as wide row and narrow row production. So those are the two main methods as has been discussed earlier. But your wide row production method requires heavy tillage ahead of planting, so either fall or spring. Usually fertilizer is incorporated at that time. And then 22-inch row spacing is the most common used in Saskatchewan, but that can range from 20 to 30 inch in different areas. Inter-row cultivation is essential. So the first pass is the cultivation pass, mainly for weed control. And the second pass is a hilling pass, so actually produce a bit of a hill, which facilitates with the undercutting. So undercutting, the picture on the right-hand side kind of shows, as you can see, yours truly operates some of the equipment. So I take some pictures from the cab, but basically the undercutter is a one-pass unit just prior to harvest, where it's like a rod weeder, lifts the plants, cuts it below the surface, and then throws it into a windrow. And then typically it's a week to 10 days of drying time before it's mature enough to pick up with the specialized combine. As Dennis had alluded to, Pickett is a specialized bean combine that is gentle handling. We own 2 of them for doing the specialized harvesting in wide rows. The other production method is the narrow row production. Specifically, I'm talking about 15-inch rows using a planter, but would also be similar with an air seeder in the 10 or 12-inch spacing. So this is your minimum tillage method. Requires land rolling after planting. You can either swath or desiccate, and then direct harvest with traditional harvesting equipment. And I'll give some hints towards the end as to some things that can be incorporated to make life easier with direct harvest. Classes and varieties. As was mentioned also earlier, discussing with your potential buyers is very, very key. You want to be growing something that they want to buy, but also they offer production contracts to allow for take some risk off the table up front. Usually they have seed available as well, so having those discussions is key in picking your class and variety. Varietal data is very regional specific. I really like to highlight this fact because I often talk to guys and say, well, I've seen some data from Montana that says that, it'll mature here, or Southern Manitoba, it'll mature here. And, they're showing that it's less than 100 days. I take that as a grain of salt. The best data you can get is something that's as close to you as you can get. Also realize that each year is slightly different, but either way, there is good data to be able to pick that. And varieties react differently in different climate and geography is the key to all that. So early maturity is something specifically we got to be considerate of in Saskatchewan. We're one of the most northern growing regions of all edible beans, so less than 100 days to miss those frost-free days. Beans are very sensitive to frost, both after they come up, but also right till they're mature. So you got to be cautious of that. Consider something with upright plant structure. I was mentioned with the varieties that were listed earlier, that group or type 1 or type 2 are the 2 predominant types anyway, but that just puts the flowers and the pods up higher on the plant. And high pod set is most important for solid seeded production, obviously getting the pods as high off the ground as possible. For markets, desirable traits for markets are color, size, etc. I want to consider secondary markets. Certain types do have secondary markets, being pet food or canning for the less desirable ones that would sit on the shelf or be sold at market. And also something to consider is a slow to darken pinto, or specifically pintos have that trait, and that allows for a longer shelf life. It's been in the industry for a number of years, and we're only a couple of varieties that were actually accessible to us. The issue being that some of the buyers are finding that they actually don't degrade in storage, which makes them very challenging to determine how old they are. And if they're going to be cooked, the longer they've been left on the shelf, the harder they are to cook, to the point that sometimes they won't cook. So the industry is working around that, but it definitely makes a more desirable bean to sell, for, especially in a market where we're far away from our end user in lots of cases. So there's a time lapse between when our crop gets to the market. So having that quality kept there is positive. So moving right into it, so our dominant classes mentioned earlier are Pinto, Navy, and Black Bean. These classes can be considered for both narrow row and wide row production. Certain varieties do lend themselves as more conducive to narrow row production with a high pod height. So this is based off of my own experience, both on our own farm, but also running a custom operation that predominantly it's AC Island, CDC White Mountain 3, and there is some vibrant pinto beans grown in Saskatchewan, be it small acres, and definitely with the asterisks, it's a longer season variety, so the risk is quite a bit higher. As pictures actually that were shown by Anna earlier were from my field, growing vibrant pinto beans back in 2020. So Navy beans, they're CDC White Track. It's just up and coming. It's actually not commercially available at the moment. There's seed production being ramped up in hopes of seeing more acres in the future. So Portage and AAC shock, and again, the asterisk on shock being a little bit on the later side. And for black beans, CDC Blackstrap and CDC Superjet again being a little on the long side. As for niche types, and again, this is from my own experience, these classes are limited to wide row production only due to seed size, growth habit, and pod height. So cranberry beans do have a certain fit here in Saskatchewan. The varieties that I've seen grown are Etna's, Crimsons, and OAC cranberry is another one that I actually haven't seen in the field, but it's seen in plots, but longer season being out of an Ontario program. As for yellow beans, CDC Sunburst is a yellow bean that was talked about earlier as well. I was bred here in Saskatchewan, and I have seen it in the field as well. Moving to field considerations, so rotation is one big thing that I like to consider. I have numerous guys that want to go in after canola, and I always caution with canola. It's nice for the sake that there's not as much trash to deal with, but canola, as we know, is as much a weed after growing it and can be for numerous years. So a flushing weed as well, which can be problematic, but also the fact that Sclerotinia infected canola can also infect edible beans. The other is obviously heavy stubble. So cereal stubble is typically what we'd like to rotate into, but the key to it is having good stubble or trash management at harvest time. As I show in the picture here, when you leave a lot of stubble, it's very challenging to plant into, but also the soils don't warm up nearly as quick on that ground either. So well drained, this is our overlap here, as was shown earlier by Dennis. Borrowed his picture a few years ago, and I still use it today. We don't have this beautiful flat Red River Valley land here at Riverhurst, so I don't have a picture of my own to show. But the fact here is that edible beans don't like their feet wet, not for extended periods, won't stand standing water, but even saturated soils are not good for edible beans. Soil texture. Again, that was brought up as well. A medium textured soil, something with a little bit of sand in it, is desirable for the sake that, one, if it's packed, it's very challenging for the beans to push through. But secondly, the lighter soils are better for draining and just easier to work in. Minimal stones is something you want to consider. Obviously, this is with most crops, but especially with direct harvest, if you're wanting to harvest on the ground, you're going to have to get those stones out of the way and cause trouble. Low weed pressure is another thing to consider. You want to pick your best fields that are most clean. It's not a real competitive crop, and there's relatively limited options for herbicides. So picking your best fields really is the key. And then residual nitrogen, as was mentioned in a couple of presentations as well, is something you want to be considerate of. Excess nitrogen can create issues with extra foliage. So moving to planting, soil temperature greater than 10 degrees C is usually when we like to start, with no risk of frost in the forecast. That typically is May 20th to June 7th is your planting date or planting window. Seeding depth 3/4 to 1.5 inches. It's just nice to get them into good solid moisture so that they can imbibe that moisture and get started. I recommend using a seed treatment, whether that be covering for insect or soil and seed-borne disease. It's just a small expense to ensure that we don't have issues there. And land rolling prior to emergence. And I really want to emphasize the prior to emergence. There really is no good reason to go after they come up. I realize that there could be circumstances, but the key is to just be there as soon as you can, and that's because they're epigeal germinators. So if their growth point comes above the surface, if that's damaged, they will not grow again. But also to mention the fact that with the frost free as well, that growth point, once it comes above the soil surface, if it's touched by frost, that will end the life of the plant. This slide is also shown by Gursahib from the inoculation study, but what I want to emphasize here is that, again, beans are very poor fixers of nitrogen. So adding additional nitrogen is a must. There's very limited commercial available inoculants out there, and it's a different strain than peas and lentils. So you must apply with nitrogen fertilizer to get top yields. So fertilizer recommendations. And again, shooting for those top yields. This was also expressed by Dennis earlier as well, but typically we're up close to that 100 pounds per acre when there's 30 pounds of available nitrogen in the soil. I do caution guys when we talk residual nitrogen that to try not to apply above 100 pounds per acre, that abundance of nitrogen is only going to result in vegetative growth, which just makes it more conducive to disease, and typically is yield decreasing rather than increasing is one thing. So plant populations, and I'll emphasize here, this is living plants. So typically with a navy bean or a black bean, we want in 15-inch rows 120 to 140 living plants, or in 22-inch rows 90 to 120,000 living plants. Pinto beans, we're usually more in that 95 to 110 range, and in 22-inch rows 85 to 100,000 living plants. That typically equates to 60 to 80 pounds per acre, but I will make the caveat that dry beans are very variable in size, so using 1,000 kernel weight is key. That all depends on that seed source. The type and the variety will dictate how drastically the difference in seed size is. Also, if you're thinking about seeding with an air drill, I was told this right off the start, as I have attempted growing edible beans with an air drill myself. That 25% increase in seeding rate is probably something that's legible, and that has to do with the fact of damaging seed as it goes through that delivery system. 25% is definitely on the high side, but I would caution on that side versus the low side, which obviously is going to increase your costs. So harvest management, swathing is one way of doing it, and again, I've done it myself. These are my pictures from a few years ago. So you're targeting that 75% buckskin pod stage, which is under 30% seed moisture. Ideally swath on a dew, so that limiting the amount of cracking of pods and leaving seed on the ground. You want to limit your green plant material because that potential height can mold in the swath. So limit it as possible. The pros are to limit your loss from shattering, and it's a quick dry down. The cons of swathing is that they're prone to blowing, and also if it begins to rain, it can take weeks to dry out that heavy swath. For desiccation, you want to check with your buyers before applying. It's very, very key. There's some sensitivities in different markets as to what can be applied, so please check on that, and it's class specific and buyer specific. But again, you're targeting that 75% buckskin, less than 30% moisture, and prior to major leaf drop is ideal to get it into the plant. Reglone and heat liquid are two that, or heat LQ I should say, are the two that have been commonly used. So talking about harvest management, So tough beans are greater than 18% seed moisture, but that's a good starting point, especially as the duration of the day, you'll see those seed moistures start to come down, and a blend in your bin isn't a bad thing. So dry is between 12 and 16% for storage, and splitting really becomes a major factor once you get below 12% seed moisture. Recommend using a flex draper for direct harvest. It hugs the ground the best and seems to feed the best to the combine. Aerials and duckbill reel tines are two accessories that potentially can help with the seed losses. I've used the duckbills myself, have not used an aerial, but I'm familiar with a couple of guys that believe in using the aerials. And also, if you're picking up swaths, it's recommended using a time type pickup. For storage, safe storage is less than 16% seed moisture. Using hopper bottom bins is ideal, obviously, but smaller to limit the drop. So obviously shorter bins, less drop. Aeration is beneficial for if you have tough beans, but that aeration duct in the bin can be damaging to the seed if it's not being used. So something to consider when you're storage. Conveyor is a must, both for loading and unloading the bin. Obviously very delicate, would not recommend at all putting through an auger. Bean ladders is another accessory that can be put into a bin and limit the dropping that falls to the floor of the bin, and actually slows it down and will decrease the damage. And for long-term storage, oxidation and mold are two things to consider. They're very much like peas. They're living in the bin. They move their moisture moves towards the top of the bin and the heat, and that's an environment that can be problematic. So always keep an eye on your bins. And obviously, if that happens, that will be a grading factor in the future. For marketing, processor-driven market, lots of proprietary rights, both to varieties and seed. So your seed supply in lots of cases is going to come from a processor, and typically they're wanting you to sign production contracts with them to access that seed. So something to be familiar with. You want to be dealing with somebody you're comfortable with, but also sourcing good seed. And quality is king in the edible market, both color and size. There are secondary markets. So the canning market, like I mentioned, and pet food market. Specifically, that seems to be more navy beans and pinto beans that fit into that. It's a little more challenging to find secondary markets for some of the others. Production contracts, typical contract is first 800 pounds or first 1,000 pounds per acre with the first right of refusal on the remaining production. And you'll want to read and discuss those contracts with your buyer. There can be movement on say freight, for instance. They'll do picked up farm pricing. There might be a window when they want production to move in. They may pay storage, being that we're further away from some of the market. Those type of things you'll want to include in your production contract if they're willing. So some key take homes. Potential buyer contact your potential buyer for market conditions, production contracts, and production barriers. Select a class and variety that matures in less than 100 days. Start with high germ, disease-free seed. Pick a well-drained field with low weed pressure, few rocks, and no herbicide carryover. Calculate seeding rates using 1,000 kernel weight and account for seed damage up to 25% if you're thinking of using an air seeder. Plant into soil temperatures greater than 10 degrees C with no risk of frost. Typically that's May 20th to June 7th. Careful with compacting wet soils and soil crusting, especially if you're in a heavier clay. Land roll shortly after planting prior to emergence. Early weed control is essential. If conditions are conducive for disease, apply fungicide preventatively prior to canopy closure. Swath or desiccate at 75% buckskin, less than 30% moisture. Allow leaf drop for swathing. Attempt to hold leaves on with desiccating. This really helps with direct harvest. That's an experience thing. Harvest between 15 and 18% moisture to limit splitting. And load hopper bottom bins with a conveyor for short and long-term storage. Kind of flew through that, but hopefully we get some questions. But I've left my contact information, and by all means, I'm I'm here to support anybody that's interested in growing dry beans, right from asking the basic questions to experienced growers that might want to bounce some ideas off me. So with that,
Thanks very much, Jeff. That
Good.
was an excellent presentation, and rounded out, I think, all of the information quite nicely for all that was talked about today. So that was superb. I'm going to thank you for that. We do have some questions for you, and so I'll just get right to that. First one I had, actually, when you talked about 25% damage in an air seeder, like, is there any means to help reduce that you can modify the air seeder with? And maybe
So there is some things on the market, I think, that can help with it. It's going to be specific to what type of machine, and I'm not going to pick on any of them because we all know their differences, depending on how many splitting operations there is between the air cart and it getting to the seed boot is one factor. Obviously, the type of metering system that's on the machine, whether that's an auger meter or a roller meter, makes a difference. Seed breaks are something that I've heard potentially could help. But the key is the fact that, yeah, from the point that it's metered to the point that it gets to the ground, how many collisions of seed, how dry is your seed is another major factor. So obviously, the tougher the seed, the more of that it can take. So that's just a general number to use to make sure that you're hitting what you want for plant population.
Okay, a couple more here. Being that you've worked with the ministry before, how can the ministry or agronomists, and there's lots of agronomists in the field these days, help spread information and help farmers get started in dry beans?
Yeah, that's a good question because you're exactly right. I sat in that seat at one time and got asked those questions, and I think, well, the key one is the grower. There's got to be grower interest first, and obviously something like this is key to getting that information out. And obviously, the Saskatchewan Pulse growers actually have done a really good job here in the last number of years of adding this information to their website and getting that in front of growers. So I think that's important. Obviously, field days and stuff like that are an opportunity as well. I know up at Outlook, through ICDC, there's an opportunity, but there's also the Riverhurst Bean Festival here at Riverhurst, which I'm in part in hosting, but we do a field tour there as well, and it actually gets to show you it in the field and have that discussion. But yeah, like I said, I think the real key is to come back to the fact that this is a crop that mainly fits under irrigation. I do think there's a fit outside of irrigation in certain growing regions, as was discussed earlier, more in that black soil zone, and where there is some limited options on what they can grow. So, I think in time we'll see a little more interest potentially come out of those areas, but it's like any new crop that it takes a little bit of time to get into it, one, but secondly, taking the risk. And then there's all these other factors that I mentioned of, dealing with processors, Manitoba, Alberta, so your distance to market, those types of things obviously play into it too. So.
Two more questions that are here for you, Jeff. One is, do you provide machine rental or custom work around the Riverhurst area?
It's custom work, yep. So our basis is around Lake Diefenbaker, and so we just purchased into this business last year, but it had been being run by a very, very knowledgeable individual. Many might know as Idaho Joe or Joe Brennan. He left us a few years ago, passing away, and was left to his wife to run for a couple more years. But at a time, Joe was running at his peak 10,000 acres of custom production around Lake Diefenbaker, and so that was kind of our vision, was to take that over and be able to offer that to this area as well. And I don't think we have visions of getting to 10,000 anytime soon, but we're happy to have that service available to anybody who would like to give it a try.
And this last question is kind of an important one. I know that I've had some contact with processors, buyers in the past, but have you seen or heard any possibility of processors, buyers expanding or providing more seed to increase acres in production in Saskatchewan? Or how do you see the bean industry growing in Saskatchewan? So, I know I spoke to them before too. And
No, that is an interesting question, and actually it was 2 years ago I really gauged a big uptick in interest, and it has festered out a little bit, and then maybe that speaks to the way the market went, but obviously drought in 2021 was a major factor. We had Manitoba companies moving further west, realizing we had irrigated production here, which obviously takes the drought out of it. So I was fielding a lot more calls from companies that I typically didn't hear from. That being said, that has carried in. And I guess now that I'm attached to some more production, that probably helps with it as well. But the fact is that they are looking here. The irrigation expansion announcement was maybe something on the heels of that as well back in 2020. To see that potential come through obviously would be huge for edible beans and irrigation. And so those are a couple of the factors I think that are going to play into that. That being said, we've got companies like AGT, for instance, has a big presence in the pulse industry in Saskatchewan. You wouldn't maybe know, but they're in the edible bean industry as well, and their plant is in Manitoba though. So they're actively looking, but we're pretty small peanuts at the moment. So something like that. Also, there is Rudy Agro is situated in Outlook. They specialize in edible beans, but also other pulses. And McDougall Acres is another one that maybe people aren't familiar with, or are handling edible beans at a smaller volume than some of these big companies are. But I think obviously with acreage increase, there would be more interest. I've had that conversation for the 15 years that I've been involved in edible bean production, is why can't we get production or get processing here? And it's a scalability thing. Until we really can eclipse that 10,000 acres that we keep running up against and falling back, I don't see a ton of interest, but there's a few things in play right now that could push us over that, and then I think we'll see things develop.
yeah, and I think you mentioned one of them, Jeff, the province's plan to increase irrigated acres by, I think if you wanted to maybe mention that as well, which I think could be a big boost for bean production in Saskatchewan.
Absolutely, no, that is a major factor, and hopefully we see some of that come on. I mean, there's been significant acre increases here the last couple of years, and I think we'll see that continue, especially if it's going to stay dry. So.
Yeah, well, I think we've run into that time of day when a lot of people's stomachs are starting to speak to them, because it's now 20 minutes after 12 noon, and we don't really have a whole lot of questions popping up anymore, so people must be getting hungry. So I just wanted to thank you and thank all our speakers who I see are still online with us today for all of your time and your presentations. It was excellent. I'm kind of hoping that we can see an increase in the interest in bean production here in Saskatchewan. I think the opportunity is prime for that, and can certainly take advantage of that possibility for that huge market, as Chuck had alluded to. So thank you again to all our speakers for the great information. We appreciate the time you took to join us today. This time we'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for the event. Don't forget to use the QR code, which will pop up on the screen shortly, to get credit for the event if you are a CCA. If you have any issues or have missed out on the code but attended live, please contact us and we will make sure you get the credit. Credits are only available for those watching the entire webinar live. Please take the time to fill out the survey that will pop up when you exit from the program. This is the best way to get your feedback on what research or questions you have on dry beans, so we can continue to provide a spotlight on the topic in the future. Also, feel free to reach out to speakers of your local crops specialists when any questions. If anybody has any questions regarding these topics or anything related to farming, please contact your local Sask Ag Regional Office or the Agriculture Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377. That's again 1-866-457-2377, and we will be sure to put you in contact with a specialist to help answer your questions. Thanks again for joining us for today's session, and we'll have the QR code up for you shortly. Thank you.